The kingdom threw him out like garbage. King Varric Draven, the Iron Alpha who'd bent nations to his will, cast into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back and a rage that could burn down empires. They said he'd gone soft, said an Omega woman made him weak. But here's what those silk-wrapped cowards in their marble halls didn't understand. A wolf doesn't stop being dangerous just because you steal his crown. He gets meaner, hungrier, and when he comes back, he doesn't come for mercy. So buckle up, because this story's about to get bloody. Stay until the end to see how a discarded king rebuilds himself from ashes, and drop a like with your city name in the comments so I know my tribe is watching. You're going to need to see this through. The rain hit like cold judgment the night they came for him. Varric stood in the center of the Grand Council chamber, watching men he'd trusted with his life arrange themselves into a firing squad of words. The torches guttered in their sconces, throwing shadows that made the painted wolves on the walls look like they were laughing. Maybe they were. Even the dead king seemed to know what was coming. Lord Theron spoke first. Of course he did. The man had always loved the sound of his own voice, especially when it carried the weight of condemnation. "You have disgraced this throne," Theron said. His jowls quivered with righteous fury. "An Omega, in the palace, under royal protection, and now you speak of making her queen." Varric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Let them talk. Let them perform their little theater of outrage. He'd learned long ago that men who spoke the loudest usually had the most to hide. Chancellor Vorden stepped forward, his silver chains of office clinking like shackles. "We have tolerated your eccentricities, Your Majesty. We understood that gratitude for saving Princess Elira might cloud your judgment temporarily, but this has gone too far. The bloodlines must remain pure. The hierarchy must be preserved." Preserved? Varric almost laughed. They talked about preservation like they were protecting something sacred instead of protecting their own positions. These men didn't care about bloodlines. They cared about control. About keeping the world arranged exactly as their fathers had left it, with them on top and everyone else beneath their boots. Lady Maricent, the only woman on the council and twice as vicious as any of the men, delivered her blow with surgical precision. The military is restless. The noble houses are questioning your fitness to rule. Even your own guard whispers doubts. You have become a liability to the realm you swore to protect. A liability. 20 years of conquest. 15 wars won. 3 rebellions crushed before they could draw breath. And now he was a liability because he dared to see worth in someone these perfumed parasites considered beneath notice. "Speak then," Varric said quietly. His voice cut through the chamber like a blade through silk. "Tell me my crime." Maelor Vane rose from his seat. The High Chancellor moved like a snake trying to remember how to walk upright. "Your crime," he said, "is weakness. The Iron Alpha we followed would never have allowed sentiment to compromise the throne. But you? You've let an Omega woman make you soft. You've dismissed loyal advisors who questioned her presence. You've rewritten laws that stood for centuries. And for what? For love?" He spat the word like it was poison. The room held its breath. Varric looked at each of them in turn, studied their faces, saw the fear beneath their anger, and understood something fundamental that he'd been too distracted to notice before. They weren't trying to save the kingdom. They were trying to save themselves. Because if an Omega could rise to stand beside a king, then what did that say about their carefully constructed hierarchy? If worth could be earned through action instead of inherited through blood, then what value remained in their titles? What protection remained in their names? Everything they were depended on the world staying exactly as it was. And he'd threatened to change it. "You want to know about weakness?" Varric's voice dropped to something dangerous. "I'll tell you about weakness. Weakness is a dozen armed men needing a child's exile to feel safe. Weakness is calling tradition sacred when all it protects is your own comfort. Weakness is standing in this chamber pretending you're defending the realm when we all know you're defending your estates and your gold and your right to look down on people who've done more with nothing than you've done with everything." Lord Theron's face went purple. "How dare you?" "I dare because I'm still king," Varric roared. The words echoed off stone walls. "And I'll be king until you find the spine to say what you really mean. So say it. Call the vote. Strip my crown if that's your play. But don't stand here wrapping your cowardice in patriotism and expecting me to bow to it." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Maylor smiled. It was not a pleasant thing. As you wish, Your Majesty, we call for an emergency council vote on your fitness to rule. All in favor of removing King Varric Draven from the throne? Hands rose. Not all of them. A few counselors kept their arms folded, their faces troubled. But enough. More than enough. The count didn't even need to be finished. 17-5. Varric had lost his kingdom by popular vote. The motion carries, Maylor said softly. Effective immediately. You are removed from power. Your titles are stripped. Your authority dissolved. Guards will escort you from the palace within the hour. You're banished from sovereign reach and forbidden from contact with any member of the royal family, including your daughter. Something shifted in Varric's chest, something cold and sharp and final. Elira? His voice cracked on her name. Lady Maricent's smile held no warmth. The princess requires stability, protection from influences that might compromise her development. You've proven you cannot provide that. She will remain here, under proper supervision, until she comes of age. They were taking his daughter, his 9-year-old daughter who still had nightmares about the attack in the marketplace, who only slept soundly when Ceres sat beside her bed telling stories about brave girls who saved kingdoms, who'd started laughing again for the first time since her mother died. They were taking her and calling it protection. Varric's hands curled into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to draw the sword hanging at his belt and remind these soft-bellied aristocrats what an alpha in his prime could do to men who'd grown comfortable behind walls. He could kill half of them before the guards reached him, could paint these pristine marble floors with their treacherous blood. But Elira was somewhere in this palace, and violence now meant she'd see her father cut down like a rabid animal. So he did the hardest thing he'd ever done. He nodded once, turned, walked toward the doors without another word. Theron called after him, "Oh, and Draven, the Omega woman leaves tonight as well, separately. We wouldn't want you getting ideas about running off together to play at romance in exile." Varric stopped, didn't turn around, just stood there with his back to them, shoulders tight enough to snap. "Where is she?" "Already removed from the palace," Maylor said. Quite cooperative, actually. Seemed to understand that her presence had become problematic. "Perhaps she was wiser than you in that regard." The words were designed to wound, to suggest betrayal, to make him doubt everything that had grown between them. But Varric knew Ceres better than that. She hadn't cooperated. She'd calculated, had seen which way the wind was blowing and chosen survival over sentiment. That was her way. That was how she'd stayed alive in a world designed to erase people like her. And he didn't blame her for it, not even a little. The guards flanked him as he walked through corridors he'd walked 1,000 times as king. Servants ducked into doorways to avoid meeting his eyes. Courtiers whispered behind their hands. The palace that had been his was already learning to exist without him. They gave him 30 minutes to gather belongings from his chambers. He took his sword, his riding coat, a miniature portrait of Elira that he kept in his desk drawer. Nothing else seemed to matter. The quartermaster presented him with a horse at the palace gates. Not one of the royal destriers. A common bay mare with kind eyes and mud on her hooves. Even in exile they were sending messages. "You'll ride north," the captain of the guard said. He'd served under Varric for 12 years. Wouldn't look him in the eye now. "Orders are to keep moving until you clear the kingdom's border. Don't come back. They'll arrest you as a pretender if you do." Varric swung into the saddle, looked back at Nightspire Palace rising against the storm clouds like something out of a legend. His home, his prison, his past. "Captain, sir, take care of my daughter." The man flinched like he'd been struck, finally met Varric's eyes. "I will, I swear it." It was small comfort, but it was something. Varric rode through sovereign reach as rain began to fall in earnest, past the markets where Ceres had saved Elira's life, past the merchant quarters where common folk had once shouted his name like a prayer, past the silver rivers and the black cliffs and all the gleaming beauty that was about to belong to someone else. The gates stood open. He didn't look back. The first 3 days were the worst, not because of the physical hardship. Varric had campaigned through worse weather with worse provisions, had slept in mud and eaten cold rations, and marched until his feet bled. The body could endure almost anything if the mind stayed disciplined. But the mind was the problem. Because when you spent 20 years as a king, your entire identity got wrapped around that crown. Every decision filtered through the question of what was good for the realm. every relationship calculated for political advantage, every moment performed under the weight of history watching. Strip that away and what was left? Just a man. Middle-aged and hard-used, with skills that meant nothing outside the context of power. He could plan military campaigns for an army he no longer commanded. He could negotiate treaties for a kingdom that had exiled him. He could make decisions that affected millions of lives that would never know he'd tried to help them. Useless. All of it useless. The Northern Territories were harsh country even in summer. Varric rode through pine forests so thick the sun barely reached the ground, crossed rivers swollen with snowmelt that came up to his horse's chest, slept in abandoned shepherds' huts that smelled of damp wool and old smoke. He thought about Ceres constantly, wondered where they'd sent her, whether she was safe, whether she thought about him, or if survival had already pushed him into the category of things that no longer mattered. Their last real conversation haunted him. They'd been standing on the frost-lit balcony overlooking the city, 2 weeks before everything fell apart. The air had been cold enough to burn, and she'd wrapped his cloak around her shoulders without asking. "What happens when they've had enough?" she'd said quietly. "When tolerating me becomes too expensive?" Varric had pulled her closer. "They won't. I won't let them." She'd looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes. "You can't stop weather by willing it. When the storm comes, we save what we can and let the rest go." He'd kissed her then, tried to argue with touch instead of words. But she'd been right. She was usually right about things that mattered. And now the storm had come and they'd both been swept away from each other. On the 4th day, he reached the border garrison at Ironwood Pass. The soldiers there were young, hadn't served under him, didn't recognize his face without the crown and the ceremonial armor, just saw another traveler looking for a roof and a meal. He paid for a bed with the last of his coin and sat in the common room listening to them talk. Heard about the new king. They'd moved fast. Probably had it planned before the council even voted. Lord Theron had been crowned in an emergency ceremony, accepted the throne with great reluctance, according to the official story, promised to restore stability and traditional values to a kingdom that had lost its way. The propaganda made Varric's teeth hurt. But what really cut was when one young soldier said, "I heard the old king went mad," started making wild claims about conspiracies, had to be removed for his own safety. His sergeant nodded. "Sad thing, used to be a great man. But power does things to people, makes them paranoid, makes them see enemies everywhere." They were rewriting him, turning his removal into a mercy. A necessary intervention. By the time they were done, history would remember him as the cautionary tale, the king who fell in love and lost his mind. Varric left before dawn. Couldn't stand to hear any more. He rode deeper into the wilderness, past the last outposts of civilization, into country where the maps just said, "Dragons here." Not because there were dragons, just because no one had bothered to explore what actually existed beyond the comfortable borders of the known. And it was there, 5 days past Ironwood, that the wolves found him. Real ones this time. Not painted on walls or carved into thrones. Just hungry animals looking for prey in the thin weeks before spring brought easier hunting. There were 7 of them. They circled his camp at dusk. Gray shapes moving between the trees like smoke. The mare nickered and pulled at her tether. Wanted to run. Varric didn't blame her. He drew his sword and put his back to a boulder. The wolves studied him with yellow eyes. Calculating. Testing. Trying to determine if he was dangerous enough to avoid or weak enough to kill. The pack leader was a big male with a scarred muzzle. Battle-tested. Smart. He made a sound low in his chest that wasn't quite a growl, more like a question. Varric bared his teeth, made a sound of his own. The wolf huffed, almost like laughter. Then the entire pack attacked. Varric had been in 100 fights, dueled blade masters and killed men twice his size. But fighting humans followed rules. Logic. Strategy. Even in the chaos of battle there was pattern. Wolves didn't care about rules. They came from 3 sides at once, snapping at his legs while the big male went for his throat. He caught that one across the muzzle with his blade, sent it yelping back with blood on its face. But another got his calf. Teeth punched through leather and found meat. He roared, kicked, felt ribs crack under his boot. The wolves broke, regrouped, came again. His sword was slippery with blood. His vision narrowed to teeth and eyes and the whistling sound his blade made cutting through air. There was something almost clean about it. No politics, no betrayal, just survival stripped down to the most honest transaction in the world. You want to kill me? Try harder. He caught one wolf across the spine. It went down howling. Another tried to hamstring him and lost an eye to his dagger. The pack was learning that this particular prey came at a higher cost than they'd expected, but Varric was tiring. His breath came in ragged gasps. Blood ran down his leg from the calf wound. His sword arm felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The big male sensed it, circled closer, gathering for the final rush. Then something flew out of the darkness and hit the wolf in the skull. A rock. Perfectly aimed. Another followed. Caught a second wolf in the ribs hard enough to crack bone. The pack scattered, confused. A two-legged prey shouldn't have allies. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. Varric spun, saw a figure standing at the edge of his firelight, short, compact, wearing ranger's leather and a bow across her shoulders. The figure stepped closer, and he saw her face in the flames. Not Ceres, but someone who carried the same kind of damage in her eyes. "You fight loud," the woman said. Her voice had gravel in it. Probably been smoking pine bark since she was 12. "Heard you from half a mile off. Sounded like you needed a hand." Varric lowered his sword. The wolves had retreated into the forest. He could hear them rustling in the underbrush, deciding whether to try again or find easier prey. "I had it handled." The woman laughed. It was a broken sound. "Sure you did. That why you're bleeding out standing in a pile of wolf corpses?" "Not corpses." He checked. 3 wolves dead or dying. The rest had vanished. Most of them anyway. She walked closer, studied him with the kind of attention a hunter gives to tracks. "You're running from something. No one comes this deep alone unless they're running or stupid. Both, maybe." She nodded like that was a reasonable answer. "Got a camp about a mile east, stream nearby. You can clean those wounds before they go septic. After that you move on and we never met." "Deal. Why help me?" She shrugged. "Maybe I'm tired of watching idiots die in my forest. Makes the place smell bad." It wasn't trust, but it was something, and Varric was too tired to care about the difference. He followed her through the trees. His legs screamed with every step, but he kept moving. Discipline. Training. The body follows where the mind leads if you don't give it permission to quit. Her camp was exactly what he'd expected. Lean-to shelter, fire pit, gear organized with military precision. She'd been out here a while. "Sit," she ordered, pointed to a log near the fire. He sat. She cleaned his wounds without ceremony or gentleness, poured something that burned like liquid fire into the bite marks. Varric gritted his teeth and didn't make a sound. "You military?" she asked. "Was." "Yeah." She tied off the bandage with practiced hands. "I can tell. You got that look? Like part of you's still standing at attention waiting for orders that aren't coming." "What happened to you?" Her hands paused, then kept working. "Same thing that happens to everyone eventually. Trusted the wrong people. Did my duty. Got thrown away when I wasn't useful anymore." Varric felt something shift in his chest. "What's your name? Does it matter?" "Probably not, but I'd like to know anyway." She sat back, studied him for a long moment, then seemed to decide something. "Kara. Used to be Ranger Captain Kara Vole of the Ironwood 4th. Now I'm just the crazy woman who lives in the woods and talks to bears." "What did you do? To get exiled?" "Told the truth when I should have stayed quiet." She poked at the fire with a stick. "Commander was selling military supplies to smugglers. I reported it. He was the Duke's cousin. I was nobody important. Guess which one of us they believed." Varric knew that story. Had probably been part of enforcing it a dozen times without knowing. "How long ago?" 3 years. Long enough that I stopped expecting anyone to come apologize. Long enough that I realized I like trees better than people anyway." They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance a nightbird called. "You're not just ex-military," Kara said finally. "You got command weight on you, the kind that doesn't wash off." "What were you?" Varric hesitated, then decided lies took more energy than he had left. "King." She froze, turned to stare at him. The fire threw shadows across her face that made her look ancient, Then she started laughing. Not cruel laughter, not mocking, just the exhausted laughter of someone who'd seen enough of the world's bitter jokes to recognize another one. Of course, she said. Of course the Iron Alpha himself would end up bleeding in my camp. That's perfect. That's just perfect. She shook her head. What did you do to get thrown out? Let me guess. Cared about the wrong person? Something like that. Yeah. She threw another stick on the fire. That'll do it. Can't have kings acting like people. Might give the rest of us ideas. They didn't talk much after that. Kara gave him a blanket that smelled like pine smoke and old wool. Varric wrapped himself in it and tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't stop. Kept circling back to the same question. What now? He'd lost his crown, his daughter, his love, his entire identity stripped away like bark from a tree. Most men would break under that, would drink themselves to death in some border town or fall on their sword rather than face the humiliation. But Varric wasn't most men. He'd built himself from nothing once before. Farm boy from the outer provinces. No title, no bloodline, just ambition and skill and a willingness to bleed for what he wanted. Had clawed his way up through the military ranks. Had won enough battles that they couldn't ignore him anymore. Had married into royalty because he'd saved the old king's life and the princess had wanted him. Everything he'd been, he'd made himself. And if he'd done it once, the thought took shape slowly, like dawn coming through heavy clouds. He couldn't get his kingdom back by asking nicely. The council had the legal authority, had the military backing, had already started rewriting history to justify their coup. But legal authority only mattered if people chose to respect it, and history was written by whoever survived. Varric sat up, stared into the dying fire, felt something cold and clear settle into his chest where rage and grief had been eating him alive. He couldn't be king again. Not the same king, but maybe he could be something else. Something they'd never see coming. Kara was awake, watching him from across the fire with knowing eyes. You got that look, she said softly. The planning look. The dangerous one. What are you thinking? Varric met her gaze. Tell me something. Do you still remember how to command a squad? She sat up slowly. Yeah, I remember. Good. Because I'm going to need soldiers. Real ones. Not parade ground ornaments. People who know what loyalty actually costs. For what? Varric smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf that had just remembered how to hunt. For taking back what's mine. Building an army from scratch, with no money, no authority, and a price on your head was exactly as hard as it sounded. Varric spent the next month moving through the northern territories like a ghost. Kara led him to places that didn't show up on official maps, settlements of outcasts, villages of people who'd been pushed past the comfortable borders because they didn't fit the kingdom's neat categories. Exiled soldiers, dispossessed farmers whose land had been seized for noble hunting grounds, Omegas who'd fled mandatory registration, craftsmen bankrupted by guild corruption, all the people the kingdom had thrown away and then forgotten about. Varric talked to them in taverns that smelled like desperation, in workshops lit by candles made from kitchen grease, in town squares where the fountain had run dry 3 winters ago and nobody in Sovereign Reach cared enough to fix it. He didn't lie to them, didn't promise easy victory or guaranteed success, just told them the truth. The people running your kingdom think you're disposable. Think strength means standing on your throat. They'll keep taking and taking until there's nothing left but bones. I can't give you back what they stole. Can't promise you'll survive what comes next. But I can promise you this. If we win, things change. If we win, worth gets measured by what you do, not what you're born as. Some laughed in his face. Some reported him to local authorities. But some looked at him with eyes that had been dead for years and saw something flicker back to life. Hope was a dangerous thing. But Varric had learned to wield dangerous things. His first real recruit was a blacksmith named Torvin, huge man with burn scars covering his arms. He'd been exiled for refusing to forge weapons for a noble's private army. Said his conscience wouldn't allow it. Conscience doesn't pay bills, Varric said. Torvin hammered a piece of red-hot iron into shape. No. But neither does bowing to men who treat you like a tool. Figure I'd rather starve honest than live comfortable on my knees. How many weapons can you make in a month? Torvin looked at him. Really looked. saw something that made him set down his hammer. How many do you need? The second recruit found him. A woman calling herself Shadow Swift. Assassin, scout, smuggler, whatever paid. She appeared in his camp one night like she'd materialized from darkness itself. Heard you're collecting broken toys, she said. Figured I'd apply. Varric's hand went to his sword. State your business. Already did. I'm here because someone's paying good money for your head, and I don't like the people doing the paying. She shrugged. Enemy of my enemy. Besides, you're going to need someone who knows how to move quiet and kill quieter. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, but you will, because you're desperate and smart enough to know that desperate men don't get to be picky about their help. She was right. He hated that she was right. By the end of the second month, he had 30 people. Not soldiers. Not yet. Just angry, damaged people who decided that dying for a chance at change beat living on their knees. Kara trained them. She was brutal about it. Didn't care about feelings or fairness, just results. Half the recruits quit in the first week. Said she was worse than any sergeant they'd ever served under. The ones who stayed got sharper, faster, meaner. Varric watched them transform and felt something he hadn't felt since before the exile: purpose. But training fighters was the easy part. The hard part was becoming someone worth following, because these people hadn't known him as king, hadn't seen him in ceremony and power. They just saw a man with expensive sword technique and political ambitions. He had to earn their respect the same way he'd earned it the first time, by bleeding with them. They sparred every morning. Varric fought anyone who wanted a match, didn't pull punches or rely on old reputation. Just showed them that whatever else he'd lost, he hadn't lost the edge that made him dangerous, lost almost as often as he won. His body wasn't 20 anymore. The recruits were hungry and desperate in ways that gave them speed he couldn't quite match. But he never quit, never called a fight early, never used his former rank to avoid getting his ass kicked by someone half his age. And slowly, grudgingly, they started to believe. One night he found Torvin working late in the makeshift forge they'd built. Can't sleep? Varric asked. The blacksmith looked up. Sweat gleamed on his bald head. Too much to think about. My daughter, she's still back there. In the kingdom, with her mother who thinks I abandoned them. Varric sat on a barrel near the fire. The heat felt good against the night cold. When this is over, you'll go back. You'll explain. Will I? Torvin hammered a blade that would probably kill someone in the next month. Or will I be dead because I followed a dethroned king into a war I can't win? Honest question. Varric appreciated that. I don't know. But I know what happens if you do nothing. You stay out here, you survive. And every day you look at yourself and remember you had a chance to change things and didn't take it. That's its own kind of death, just slower. Torvin nodded, set down his hammer. My daughter's 14, smart as fire, wants to be an engineer, but the guilds won't take girls for anything except domestic service. She asked me why. What was I supposed to say? That the world's run by men who are afraid of what happens if they let talent compete with tradition? What did you say? I told her the truth, that sometimes the only way to change a locked door is to kick it off its hinges. Varric smiled. You're going to survive this, because men who think like that are too stubborn to die. Hope you're right. Torvin picked up his hammer again, because I really want to see her face when she finds out the guilds don't get to tell her no anymore. The third month brought their first real test, a supply caravan heading to one of the northern garrisons. Military weapons, food, medicine, all the resources that kept the kingdom's border forces operational. Shadow Swift brought the intelligence, mapped the route, identified vulnerabilities. We hit it, she said. We send a message. Show the kingdom there's resistance in the territories they forgot about. Varric studied the map. How many guards? 20, maybe 30. Professional soldiers. Not going to roll over because we asked nicely. He looked at his 30 recruits. Looked at Kara. She met his eyes, and he saw the answer there. They weren't ready. But they'd never be ready if they didn't start somewhere. We move in 3 days, he said. Non-lethal when possible. We're not murderers, we're liberators. There's a difference. Shadow Swift snorted. Pretty words for what's going to be a bloodbath. Maybe. But pretty words are what separate us from them. Remember that. The raid went wrong immediately. The intel was good, the planning was solid, But plans died the moment violence started. They hit the caravan at dawn in a narrow pass where the road ran between cliff faces. Perfect ambush spot. The guards never saw them coming. Varric led from the front, took down the lead rider with a strike to the temple, non-lethal, clean. Behind him, his people poured from the rocks, and the guards turned out to be cadets, kids, 16, 17 years old, fresh from training, first assignment. They had the uniforms and the weapons, but not the experience, not the hardness. When Varric realized it, he almost called the whole thing off. But you can't pull back a stone once it's rolling downhill. Torvin crashed into 3 guards and sent them sprawling. Kara put arrows through kneecaps and shoulders. Precise. Professional. Nothing fatal. Shadow Swift moved through the chaos like her name promised, disarming soldiers before they could draw steel. And then one of the cadets panicked. Kid couldn't have been 18, babyface, hands shaking. He drew his sword and swung wild at the nearest rebel, caught Shadow Swift across the collarbone. She went down hard, blood soaked through her leathers. The cadet stared at what he'd done, dropped his sword, stood there with his mouth open. Varric was moving before his conscious mind made the decision. Crossed the distance in 4 strides, drove his fist into the kid's jaw. The cadet dropped, unconscious, not dead. Varric had pulled it at the last second, but it was close, and everyone saw how close it was. They secured the caravan, loaded half the supplies onto their own carts, set the rest aflame so the garrison couldn't recover it. Shadow Swift lived. The wound was bad, but Kara had field medicine training, stitched her up with thread designed for canvas and strong wine for anesthetic. As they withdrew, Varric looked back at the cadets. They'd tied them up, left them water. They'd be found within a day. But those kids would never forget this, would carry it forever, the day they got their asses handed to them by ghosts in the Northern Territories. Back at camp, Torven found him staring into the fire. "You pulled that punch," the blacksmith said. Varric didn't answer. "The kid hurt one of ours. Could have killed her, and you still pulled it." "Why?" "Because killing a terrified child doesn't make me a revolutionary. Makes me the same as the people I'm fighting." Torven sat beside him, poked at the fire with a stick. "You know they're going to send real soldiers now, professionals. When they hear about this, they'll stop treating us like bandits and start treating us like a threat." "Good." Varric's voice was hard. "Let them. I'm tired of being underestimated." The messenger arrived 2 weeks later. Not a soldier, not an official envoy, just a woman riding a horse half dead from exhaustion. She crashed into camp at sunset, asking for Varric by name. When they brought her to him, she pulled an envelope from inside her coat. The seal had been broken. The paper was stained with rain and blood, but Varric recognized the handwriting on the outside. Saris. His hand shook as he opened it. The letter was short, 3 sentences that hit harder than any blade. "They have a Lyra. Maelor knows you're gathering forces. If you want to see her alive again, come to Thornbreak Bridge at the next full moon. Alone." Varric's vision went red at the edges. The messenger was talking, saying something about traps and ambushes and obvious bait. Her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, because suddenly, none of it mattered. The rebellion, the recruits, the supplies and the training and the slow, careful work of building something from nothing. They had his daughter. And if he didn't go, Alyra would pay for his ambitions in ways that would haunt him until the day he died. Kara was already shaking her head. "You can't. It's suicide. Maelor wants you dead or captured. This is how he gets both." "I know." "Then why are you already planning to go?" Torvin's voice carried frustration. "We need you. This whole thing falls apart if they kill you. My daughter needs me more." The camp had gathered around them. 30 faces. Hard people who'd trusted him enough to risk everything. Who'd bled in raids and trained until their bodies broke and kept going because they believed he could actually change things. If he abandoned them now, it proved the council right. Proved he'd let sentiment compromise the mission. Proved an alpha could be broken by threatening his heart. But if he didn't go, Varric looked at each of them, then at the letter crumpled in his fist. "I'm going," he said quietly. "Thornbreak Bridge. Full moon. Alone." Kara's jaw tightened. "Then you're a fool." "Yes." He met her eyes. "Yes, I am. But I'm a fool who's getting his daughter back. After that, if I'm still breathing, We finish what we started. If I'm not, he turned to Torvin. You lead. You've got the mind for it, the heart. I'm a blacksmith. You're a man who believes worth is earned. That's better than any bloodline. He looked at Shadow Swift. Getting back up from her wound. You keep them moving quiet. Hit supply lines. Make the kingdom bleed resources. Kara, you turn them into the army I know they can be. And what do we tell people? Kara's voice was ice. That our leader ran off to die because he couldn't separate what he wanted from what was necessary? Tell them the truth. That sometimes survival means losing everything except the one thing you can't live without. He turned and walked to his tent before anyone could argue further. Because if they argued, if they made good points, if they showed him all the logical reasons this was wrong, he'd still go anyway, and the cognitive dissonance would destroy him. Better to commit to the mistake fully than half-ass two directions at once. The full moon was 3 days away. Varric spent them preparing in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or strategy. Wrote letters to Torvin, to Kara, to Shadow Swift and half a dozen others. Instructions for if he didn't come back, where supply caches were hidden, which nobles might secretly support a revolt, how to contact sympathetic elements in the military. All the knowledge locked in his head that would die with him if Mailer's trap worked. On the last night, Torvin found him sharpening his sword by firelight. My daughter asked me once why good men die young, the blacksmith said. Told her I didn't know. But I think maybe I'm starting to understand. Good men put other people ahead of themselves, and the world's not designed to reward that. Varric tested the blade's edge, drew blood. Watching kills you slower than throwing yourself in front of it. Maybe. But at least you survived to fight another day. Surviving's not the same as living. Varric cleaned the blade, started sharpening again. I've survived plenty. Played the long game, built alliances, calculated risks. And you know what that got me? A council full of traitors and a daughter in a cage. Maybe it's time to stop being smart. Or maybe this is exactly what Maelor wants. You, furious and reckless and easy to kill. Probably. But here's what Maelor doesn't understand. He threatened my child. And men who threaten children lose the right to expect rational behavior in response. Torvin was quiet for a long moment, then, if you don't come back, we burn it all down. The bridges, the supply lines, everything that keeps their comfortable world running smooth. We make them regret teaching us how expendable we are. Varric looked up, met the blacksmith's eyes, saw something there that might have been devotion, might have been friendship, might have been the recognition one broken thing gives another. That's my people. Yours, Torvin corrected. Don't forget that. Win or lose, you gave us something nobody else bothered to. You made us feel like we mattered. He left before Varric could respond, which was good because Varric's throat had gone tight and he didn't trust his voice. Dawn came cold and clear. Varric rode out alone. Behind him, 30 people stood watching, silent, still as statues carved from grief. Kara raised her fist in salute. And one by one, every person in that camp matched it. The old military salute, the one soldiers gave to leaders they'd follow into hell itself. Varric returned it, then turned his horse and rode for Thornbreak Bridge. The 3-day ride passed in a haze. Varric's mind wouldn't settle, kept playing scenarios. What Maelor would do. How to protect Elira while fighting whatever trap waited. Whether there was any possible version of this that ended with both of them alive. The math didn't work, but he'd stopped caring about math somewhere around the second day. Thornbreak Bridge was exactly where the name suggested, an old stone crossing over a gorge so deep you couldn't see the bottom. The kingdom had built it 3 centuries ago during some war nobody remembered. Now it was just forgotten infrastructure slowly crumbling into the abyss. Perfect place for an execution. Maelor was already there. Standing in the center of the bridge, 20 soldiers flanked him. All professionals, all armed, all positioned to cut off any escape route. And kneeling at Maelor's feet, wrist-bound, was Elira. She looked so small. 9 years old and she'd been sobbing. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt. When she saw Varric, something broke in her expression. Papa! The word hit him like an arrow through the chest. She tried to stand, but Maelor's hand clamped on her shoulder, held her down. The High Chancellor smiled. Punctual, he called across the bridge. I appreciate that in a condemned man. Makes everything so much more efficient. Varric dismounted, walked forward on foot, hands away from his weapons, every instinct screaming this was wrong, this was suicide. Turn back while you still can. He kept walking. Stopped 20 feet from Maelor, close enough to see Elira's eyes. Too far to reach her before the soldiers cut him down. Let her go, Varric said. She's a child. Your fight's with me. My fight's with destabilization. Maelor's voice was calm, reasonable. The voice of a man explaining obvious truth. You represent chaos, a threat to centuries of order. The girl is merely leverage. Cooperate and she goes back to the palace unharmed. Resist and... He shrugged. Well, orphans are tragic but common enough. What do you want? Public surrender. You kneel. You acknowledge that the council's authority is legitimate. You renounce any claim to the throne. You swear loyalty to King Theron, and then you ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of and stay there. Forever. And if I refuse? Maelor's smile widened. Then I kill you here. Slowly enough that she watches. And then I take her back anyway and tell everyone you died like a rabid dog in the wilderness. The story works either way. This just gives you a choice about how much your daughter has to suffer first. Elira was staring at him. Not with hope. With resignation. Like she'd already accepted this was how it ended. That look destroyed him. Because it was the same look Cerys used to get. The look of someone who'd learned that the world doesn't save you, doesn't intervene, just watches you drown and calls it natural selection. He'd pulled Cerys out of that darkness, and now his daughter was sinking into it because of him. Varric took a breath, made his choice, started to kneel. Papa, no! Elira's voice cracked. Don't! They'll kill you anyway! Don't! Maelor backhanded her. The sound echoed across the gorge. Elira went silent. Blood trickled from her split lip, and something in Varric that had been barely holding together shattered into pieces that would never fit back quite right. He stood, slowly, looking at Maelor with eyes that had gone completely flat, the eyes of a man who'd just made peace with death and discovered it wasn't frightening anymore. You know what your mistake was? His voice was conversational, casual, like they were discussing weather. You thought I came here to negotiate. Maelor frowned. What? I came here to kill you. Then everything happened at once. Arrows erupted from the cliff face above the bridge. Shadow Swift and 15 rebels Varric hadn't even known were there. They'd followed him, tracked him, set their own ambush. The soldiers went down screaming. Varric was already moving, drew his sword as he charged. Maelor stumbled backward, reaching for Elira, trying to use her as a shield. But Varric was faster. 20 years of combat experience compressed into 3 seconds of violence so precise it looked like dancing. He cut through Maelor's shoulder. Not fatal, disabling. The High Chancellor's scream was satisfying in ways Varric would regret later, but not now. Now he just grabbed Elira and ran. Behind them, the bridge erupted in chaos. Kara and Torven emerged from hiding. More rebels poured from the forest. The trap had been reversed. Maelor's soldiers tried to regroup, but they were outnumbered now, outmaneuvered, outraged. These weren't border cadets. These were broken people who'd been promised death was better than submission and decided to test that theory. Varric didn't look back, just ran with Elira clutched against his chest. She was sobbing, trembling, holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. They reached his horse. He lifted her into the saddle, climbed up behind her, spurred the mare into a gallop. The sounds of battle faded behind them. When they were a mile clear, he finally let himself check if she was hurt. Elira, can you talk to me? She nodded against his chest. I knew you'd come. Everyone said you wouldn't, said you'd abandoned us. But I knew. Her faith broke him all over again. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry you got caught in this. Are you going to be king again? Varric looked ahead at the road disappearing into forest. Thought about everything that had led here, everything still waiting. I don't know, princess, but I know I'm going to tear down everyone who hurt you. Behind them, barely audible over hoofbeats, someone was screaming. It sounded like Maelor. It sounded like the beginning of a war the kingdom wasn't ready for. And somewhere in the darkness between trees, Varric could have sworn he heard wolves howling, like they recognized one of their own finally remembering how to hunt. The horse's lungs were failing. Varric felt it in the way her gait stuttered, the way each breath came shorter than the last. They'd pushed her past exhaustion into the territory where animals just dropped and didn't get up again. He pulled back on the reins, let her slow to a walk. Behind them, the sounds of battle had faded to nothing, just wind through pine branches and Elira's ragged breathing against his chest. "We need to stop," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "Not yet. Another mile. Maybe 2. Papa, she's dying. I know." He hated that she had to see this, hated that 9 years old meant understanding that survival sometimes required using things up until they broke, but the world didn't care what children should or shouldn't witness. It just kept grinding forward, and you either learned or you died ignorant. They found a stream where the water ran clear over black stones. Varric dismounted, helped Elira down. The mare stumbled to the water's edge and drank like she'd never tasted anything so good. Her flanks heaved, foam dripped from her mouth. She'd given them everything she had. In 3 hours, maybe less, she'd be dead. Elira sat on a fallen log and stared at nothing. Blood had dried on her lip where Maelor hit her. Her hands were raw from the ropes. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in the span of a morning. Varric knelt in front of her. "Let me see your wrist." She held them out without speaking. The rope burns went deep. He cleaned them with stream water that made her flinch, bandaged them with strips torn from his shirt. His hands were steady, even though his mind was racing through calculations that all ended badly. Maelor's soldiers would regroup, send word back to Sovereign Reach. Within a day, maybe 2, every garrison in the Northern Territories would be mobilized. They'd come with hounds, with trackers, with enough force to crush his small rebellion before it could draw another breath. He'd bought Elira's freedom by declaring war, and wars didn't care about good intentions. "Are they going to kill you?" Elira's voice was small, tired, the voice of someone who'd already accepted the answer. "They're going to try." "Will they win?" Varric looked at his daughter, really looked, saw the way fear had settled into her bones, the way she held herself like prey trying not to be noticed. He'd seen that look before. In Ceres, back when she still believed the world would erase her if she made too much noise. "No." His voice carried certainty he didn't fully feel. "No, they won't win, because I'm not fighting alone anymore. And angry people who've got nothing left to lose are harder to kill than crowned heads sitting in marble halls." "You sound different. Not like a king." "I'm not a king, not anymore. Maybe that's better." She leaned against him. He wrapped his arms around her and felt how small she was, how fragile. This child was supposed to rule a kingdom someday, was supposed to make decisions that affected millions. But right now, she was just a scared little girl who'd watched her father nearly die and didn't understand why the world was so cruel. "I missed you," she whispered. The words hit harder than Maelor's blade would have. "I missed you too, Princess. Every day." They sat like that until the mare's breathing evened out, until shadows started lengthening and Varric's instinct screamed they needed to move, needed to put more distance between them and the bridge before darkness made travel impossible. He stood, checked his weapons. The sword was fine. The dagger had blood crusted on the handle. He cleaned it in the stream and felt nothing about whose blood it might be. That was the thing about violence. The first time you killed someone, it haunted you, kept you awake wondering if there'd been another way, if you'd made the right choice, if their life was worth less than the thing you were protecting. But after the 10th body, the 20th, the 100th, it just became mechanics. Action and reaction, problem and solution. The philosophy fell away and left only the oldest math in the world. You or them. Choose. Come on. He lifted Elira back into the saddle. "We've got maybe 3 hours of light left. Need to make it count." "Where are we going?" "To find the people who saved us. If they're still alive, what if they're not? Then we run until we can't run anymore. And then we fight." She nodded like this was reasonable, like her father being a fugitive king with a price on his head was just how life worked now. Maybe for her, it was. They rode through forests that got thicker the deeper they went. Ancient pines that blocked out the sun, moss hanging from branches like torn curtains. This was old country, the kind that existed before kingdoms drew borders and called nature conquered. Varric's internal map was good, but not perfect. He'd studied the Northern Territories during military campaigns. knew the major routes and garrison positions, but this deep forest, this forgotten space between official geography, he was navigating on instinct. And the instinct said his people would head northwest, away from the bridge, away from the king's roads, toward the rocky country where trees gave way to mountains and civilization stopped pretending it had a foothold. They found the first body an hour before sunset, one of Maylor's soldiers, throat cut, dragged off the path, and left for scavengers. The efficiency of it was almost beautiful. No wasted motion, no unnecessary cruelty, just death delivered and then discarded. Shadow Swift's work. Had to be. She'd promised to make them pay for every step they took. Looked like she was keeping that promise. Elira stared at the corpse. Papa? Don't look, I already saw. He felt her tense against him, waited for tears or shock or horror. The normal reactions children had to death, but Elira just took a long breath and let it out slow. Is this what it takes? She asked quietly. To survive? Sometimes. Not always. But sometimes. How do you know the difference? That's the hard part. You don't. Not until after. And by then you've already made the choice and you live with it or it kills you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm glad you came for me, even if people died. Does that make me bad? Varric's throat tightened. No. It makes you human. And humans harder than good or bad. Those are easy categories. Human means living in the space between them and trying not to lose yourself. They rode on, found 2 more bodies before darkness forced them to stop. Both soldiers, both killed with the kind of brutal efficiency that came from years of practice. His people were alive, moving fast, covering their trail with corpses. He should have felt guilty, should have mourned these men who were just following orders, who probably had families and dreams and all the complicated interior life that everyone carries. But guilt was a luxury, and Varric had learned to travel light. They made camp in a hollow between 3 massive stones that looked like they'd been dropped by giants. No fire. Too risky. Just cold rations and colder ground. Elira fell asleep almost immediately. Exhaustion took her under like a wave. Varric sat with his back against stone and kept watch. His mind wouldn't settle. Kept circling the same thoughts. He'd declared war on a kingdom he'd built. Had chosen one child over millions of people who'd trusted him to rule fairly. Had proven the council right about sentiment-compromising leadership. And he'd do it all again without hesitation. That was the thing about being an alpha that nobody talked about. People thought it meant dominance, strength, control. And sure, those were part of it. But the core truth was simpler and meaner. Alphas didn't choose the pack. The pack chose itself. And once it did, once you recognized the people you'd burn the world for, everything else became negotiable. Morality, ethics, the greater good. All those pretty philosophies that sounded profound in council chambers but meant nothing when someone touched your family. The philosophers could call it corruption, could say love made you weak, made you blind, made you dangerous to the very people you were supposed to protect. Maybe they were right, but Varric would rather be right about who mattered than wrong about everything else. Movement in the trees snapped him alert. His hand went to his sword. He was on his feet before his conscious mind registered the threat. Positioned between Elira and whatever was coming. A shadow detached from the darkness between pines. Easy. Kara's voice. Rough as gravel. It's us. She emerged into the starlight. Blood on her face, armor torn, but alive. Behind her came Torvin and Shadow Swift and 8 others. Half the force that had ambushed the ambush. Where are the rest? Varric kept his voice low. Elira stirred but didn't wake. Dead or scattered. Kara sat heavily on a rock. We hurt them, killed 15, maybe more. But they had reinforcements we didn't know about, had to break contact before they surrounded us. Torvin limped over, took something from his pack and tossed it to Varric. Found this on one of the officers. A sealed letter, royal insignia. Varric broke the wax and read by starlight. His blood went cold. What? Shadow Swift was cleaning her blades. Bad news? The worst. He looked up. They've declared martial law in the Northern Territories. Every town, every village. Anyone caught aiding or harboring us gets executed, publicly. They're not playing anymore. They never were playing. Kara pulled dried blood off her knuckles. Just took them a while to realize we weren't either. There's more. Varric read further. They've put a bounty on my head, 50,000 in gold, and another 20 for anyone who brings them information on our location. Shadow Swift whistled. That's enough gold to set up 3 generations. Someone's going to take that deal. People always do, Torvin said. Question is how long before they find us. 3 days. Varric folded the letter. Maybe less. They know roughly where we are. They'll send everything they've got, and every desperate farmer or bankrupt merchant is going to be looking for a chance to sell us out. So what's the play? Kara's eyes were hard. We can't fight an army, can't run forever with a child slowing us down, and can't surrender without ending up decorating pikes. Varric looked at Elira sleeping, at his people sitting exhausted and wounded in the dark, at the trees stretching away in every direction like prison walls made of wood. The play was impossible from the start. He'd known that, had chosen it anyway, because survival had never been the goal. Winning had never been the goal. The goal was making sure they remembered, making sure the people who threw him away understood they'd created something they couldn't control. We go north, he said finally, into the deep mountains. There are places up there the kingdom never bothered to map, places where terrain matters more than numbers. We hole up, we raid, we make them bleed for every inch, and we wait for them to make a mistake. That's not a plan. That's a stalling tactic. Shadow Swift sheathed her blades. Eventually they'll starve us out, or winter will kill us, or someone will sell us for that bounty. You're right. Varric met her eyes. It's a terrible plan, so if you've got a better one, I'm listening. Silence. Because there wasn't a better plan. There was only this, movement and violence and the desperate hope that momentum could substitute for strategy. Kara stood, stretched, her spine cracked. All right. Deep mountains, raiding, making them pay. I've followed worse plans. She looked at the others. Anyone want out? Speak now. No judgment. You signed up to fight a kingdom, not die slowly in the wilderness. Nobody moved. Shadow Swift actually laughed. It was not a sane sound. Where else am I going to get entertainment this good? Watching a disgraced king try to outstubborn an empire? That's worth dying for. Torvin nodded. My daughter deserves a world where skill matters more than breeding. If I die trying to build it, at least I die useful. One by one, the others agreed. Some with words, some with silence that meant the same thing, and Varric felt something dangerous kindle in his chest. Hope. Not the naive kind. Not the kind that believed in happy endings and justice prevailing. Just the grim practical hope that came from realizing he wasn't alone. That whatever happened next, he'd face it standing beside people who'd chosen this path, knowing exactly how badly it would probably end. We move at first light. He looked at each of them. Get what sleep you can. Tomorrow we start teaching the kingdom why you don't corner wounded animals. They settled in, took watches, passed around what little food they had. Varric noticed how thin they'd all gotten, how the wounds weren't healing as fast as they should. Exhaustion and malnutrition were taking their toll. But nobody complained. Nobody asked to turn back. They'd crossed the threshold together, and there was no path that led backward from here. Elira woke near dawn, saw the others, and her eyes went wide. It's all right. Varric kept his voice calm. These are the people I told you about, the ones who saved us. She studied them with the kind of careful attention children learn when adults have stopped being trustworthy. Are they going to die because of me? The question hit the camp like a physical blow. Torvin was the one who answered. He crouched down to her level. His scarred face probably would have terrified most children. But Elira just stared back. Kid, we're going to die because the world's run by cowards who can't stand anyone who reminds them they're cowards. You? You're just proof we're fighting for something worth dying for. I don't want people to die for me. Too bad. Kara's voice was blunt. Your father's a king. That means people die around you whether you want it or not. Only question is whether they die for something or for nothing. We chose something. Live with it. Elira's lip trembled, but she didn't cry. Just nodded like she'd been handed a burden she didn't want but would carry anyway. Varric saw too much of himself in that gesture. The weight children shouldn't have to hold. The resignation that came from understanding the world didn't care about fair. They ate, broke camp, started moving north before the sun cleared the tree line. The terrain got rougher immediately, the kind of country where you couldn't ride, where the horse became a liability instead of an asset. Varric made the call that hurt, but had to be made. He couldn't kill the mare, she'd given too much. So he stripped her tack. Let her go. Hoped she'd find her way to somewhere safe before wolves or exposure finished her. Elira cried silently as they watched her limp away through the trees. Another sacrifice on the altar of survival. The list was getting long. They climbed. The mountains rose in waves of gray stone and stubborn pine. The air got thin, cold. Every breath felt like swallowing knives. Elira struggled but didn't complain, just kept putting one foot in front of the other with the kind of grim determination that would have made her mother proud. Varric tried not to think about his dead wife, about how she'd been everything the kingdom wanted in a queen. Graceful, diplomatic, born into the right bloodline. She'd smoothed over his rough edges, had taught him how to navigate court politics without starting wars every time someone offended him, and she'd died giving birth to Elira. The kingdom's perfect queen reduced to blood and screaming in a chamber full of physicians who couldn't save her. He'd been away, leading troops against some border rebellion that barely mattered, had gotten word 3 days after she was gone. By the time he rode back, they'd already held the funeral, already sealed her in the royal crypts, already moved on like death was just another item on the kingdom's agenda. That was when he started understanding. The crown didn't care about people. It cared about continuity, about the seamless transition of power from one generation to the next. Individual lives were interchangeable parts in a machine designed to run forever, and he'd bought into it. Had believed that accepting that coldness was the price of leadership, that caring too much made you weak, made you vulnerable, made you the kind of king who'd sacrifice the realm for personal attachment. Meeting Ceres had shattered that belief, because she'd shown him what the kingdom looked like from the bottom, from the perspective of people who got ground up to keep the machine running, who died in markets or factories or gutters, while nobles debated philosophy over wine that cost more than a year's wages. She hadn't been trying to change him, hadn't been political or strategic, had just existed in a way that made his carefully constructed rationalizations feel obscene. And now he was here, climbing mountains with a child and a handful of broken people. Everything he'd built reduced to ash, everything he'd believed revealed as the comfortable lies of someone who'd never had to live without power. The philosophical frameworks dissolved. What remained was simpler, meaner, more honest. Protect yours. Make the enemy bleed. Die on your feet instead of your knees. It wasn't noble, wasn't going to inspire poets or end up in histories as anything but a cautionary tale. But it was real in a way crown and ceremony had never been. They reached a ridge near sunset, looked down into a valley where a narrow river cut between walls of stone. Smoke rose from what might have been a settlement, or might have been the remains of one. Shadow Swift studied it through a battered spyglass. 6 buildings, maybe a dozen people. Looks like hunters, or smugglers. Either way, they're off the king's maps. Can we trust them? Varric already knew the answer, but asked anyway. We can trust them to sell us out if the price is right. She lowered the spyglass. Question is whether we've got anything to trade first. What are you thinking? We need supplies. Medicine. Information on garrison movements. These people deal with both sides, kingdom and outlaws. They'll know where the soldiers are concentrated, where the weak points are. And if they decide we're worth 50,000 gold, then we kill them all and take what we need. Her voice held no emotion, no regret, just practical assessment. Better us than them. Varric looked at Elira. She was sitting on a rock catching her breath. Her face was pale, lips cracked from altitude and dehydration. They needed shelter, needed food that wasn't trail rations going bad, needed a night where they didn't sleep expecting to wake up with swords at their throats. But walking into that settlement was gambling everything on the chance that desperate people would choose humanity over gold. The math didn't look good. We go in. He made the decision and felt it settle like lead in his stomach. But we go in smart. Kara, you and half the group stay up here. Overwatch positions. If this goes wrong, you put arrows in anything that moves and we extract. Shadow Swift, Torvin, you're with me. We negotiate. But we do it with steel visible and attitudes that suggest we're meaner than we look. And the girl? Kara gestured at Elira. Comes with me. If I leave her here and something happens, she's alone. Can't risk it. They prepared in silence, checked weapons, adjusted armor. The small rituals people perform before potentially walking into violence. Varric had done this hundreds of times, before battles, before duels, before tense negotiations that could explode into bloodshed with one wrong word. Never got easier. The fear just changed shape. He knelt beside Elira. When we get down there, stay close. Don't speak unless spoken to. If fighting starts, you run. Straight back up this ridge. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. You run and you don't stop until Kara finds you. Understand? She nodded. But I won't run. Not if you need me. You'll run because I need you alive more than I need your help fighting. This isn't negotiable, Elira. You run. Her jaw set. The stubborn look she got from him. Or maybe from her mother. Hard to tell where inheritance stopped and learned behavior started. Say it. His voice went hard. Say you'll run if it goes bad. I'll run. Good. He pulled her into a brief, fierce hug. Whatever happens, I love you. Remember that. She held on tight. I know, Papa. They descended as the sun touched the horizon, moved carefully. No attempt to hide, but no aggressive posturing either. Just 4 people and a child walking into a settlement that might murder them for pocket change. The buildings were rougher up close, timber and stone. Smoke from cooking fires, pelts stretched on frames. The smell of tanning leather and poorly cured meat. People emerged from doorways, hard faces, calculating eyes. The kind of people who survived by making quick, accurate assessments of threat versus opportunity. An older woman stepped forward. Gray hair, scarred hands. She held a skinning knife like it was part of her anatomy. You lost? Not lost. Varric stopped 20 feet away, looking for trade, supplies for information. Don't look like you got much worth trading. Her eyes cataloged their weapons, their condition, landed on Elira and stayed there. Pretty child, though. That might be worth something. Varric's hand went to his sword. The woman saw it, smiled like she'd expected the reaction. Easy. Just seeing what you value makes negotiations simpler. She sheathed the knife. What kind of information you after? Garrison movements, patrol routes, places the king's men are concentrating forces. That's expensive information. You got gold? No. Weapons? Some. Not enough to matter. So what you got? Varric met her eyes, held them. Let her see the thing living behind his gaze. I've got a choice. I can walk away right now and everyone here lives. Or I can decide you're too dangerous to leave behind and kill every person in this settlement before you finish screaming. Your decision. The woman studied him, then started laughing. Hard, ugly laughter that bent her double. When she straightened, there were tears in her eyes. You're him. You're the Iron Alpha. She wiped her face. Sweet mercy, the rumors are true. The king they threw out is running around in the mountains killing anyone who looks at him wrong. Not anyone. Varric didn't relax. Just people who threaten my daughter. Yeah, I see it now. She looked at the others. You all see it? The way he's standing? That's a man who's counted the bodies and decided he's fine with the total. She turned back to Varric. All right. You want information? I'll give it to you. Free of charge. Why? Because I've got a son serving in the northern garrison. Good kid. Follows orders. And those orders right now are to hunt you down and bring back your head. She spat into the dirt. Kingdom's mobilizing 3 full companies, 600 soldiers, tracker hounds, battle mages if the rumors are true. They're coming through this valley in 2 days, sweeping everything. They find my boy doing that work, killing refugees and burning villages because some council of perfumed bastards got scared. She trailed off, shook her head. Rather you kill him quick than he lives as that kind of man. Varric felt something shift. 3 companies. Battle mages. This wasn't suppression anymore. This was extermination. You're saying they'll kill everyone, even people not involved. I'm saying they're terrified. And terrified rulers don't discriminate. They burn wide and hope they get the right target. She looked at Elira. That's your daughter? Yes. She looks like my boy did, before the kingdom got hold of him, before they taught him to stop asking why and just follow orders. The woman's voice went quiet. You want to survive? You go northeast, 3 days hard climbing. There's a place they call the Hollows, old fortress from before the kingdom existed. Stone and ice and nothing living for miles. Hide there. Wait out the sweep. Maybe you live long enough to tell her what you were fighting for. That's suicide. We'll freeze or starve. Maybe. But that's better than burning. Trust me on that. Why are you helping us? Already told you. My boy's in that army, and I'd rather lose him to your sword than watch him become the kind of man who murders children because his commander says to. At least your way he dies quick. Their way. She shook her head. Their way he lives wrong, and it eats him from inside until there's nothing left worth saving. The settlement gave them what little they could spare. Dried meat that was mostly gristle. Blankets that smelled like mildew. A map sketched on hide showing the route northeast. Varric tried to pay. Offered weapons, services. The woman refused. Just looked at Elira one more time. Keep her alive. Whatever else you do, keep that one alive. World needs people who remember why we're supposed to be better than animals. They climbed back to the ridge as darkness fell. Kara met them halfway. Got what you needed? Information. We've got 2 days before 600 soldiers sweep this entire region, and a location that might shelter us if we can reach it. Might. Kara's voice was flat. Best we're going to get. They moved through the night, pushed hard. The terrain fought them every step. Loose scree that slid underfoot. Drop-offs that appeared in the darkness like hungry mouths. Elira stumbled twice, caught herself both times, kept moving because stopping meant dying, and she'd learned that lesson well. Near dawn, they found a cave. Not deep, not comfortable, but sheltered from wind that had started carrying snow. They collapsed inside. Too exhausted to set watch properly. Too cold to care. Varric held Elira while she shivered, felt her heart beating bird-fast against his chest. She was burning energy she didn't have, pushing a body that had already given everything. If she got sick up here, she'd die. No medicine. No physicians. Just cold and altitude and the steady grind of exposure. He'd saved her from Maelor only to kill her slowly in the mountains. The thought was unbearable. So he pushed it aside and focused on practical things. How to keep her warm. How to stretch the food. How to make 2 days into 3. Survival was just a series of small decisions that bought time. String enough of them together and maybe you got lucky. Maybe you lived. And if you didn't, at least you died trying. Morning came gray and bitter. Snow fell in sheets that reduced visibility to nothing. Varric's instinct screamed to stay put. Wait out the storm. But waiting meant the garrison caught up. Meant dying trapped in a cave like animals. They moved. Blind. Following Shadow Swift, who navigated by touch and instinct. She'd grown up in country like this. Knew how to read terrain through your feet when your eyes were useless. The wind tried to kill them. Hammered from directions that made no sense. Elira went down hard twice. Second time, she didn't get up immediately. Just lay there in the snow, breathing shallow. Varric picked her up, carried her. She weighed nothing, like her bones were hollow. Like she was already fading into something that couldn't survive. Papa. Her voice barely audible over the wind. I'm slowing you down. Don't talk. Save your strength. You should leave me. They're after you, not me. If you left me, they'd stop hunting. Never. He held her tighter. Never even think that. But I'm making it worse. Making everyone else... Listen to me. His voice cut through the storm. You are not a burden. You are the reason. The only reason that matters. And I will carry you to the end of the world before I leave you behind. Understand? She pressed her face against his chest. Didn't answer. But her hands gripped his coat like she was afraid he'd change his mind. They reached the hollows near sunset of the 3rd day. The old woman's description hadn't done it justice. This wasn't a fortress. This was a scar in the mountains. Stone walls 30 feet high, carved by hands that had been dust for centuries. Gates made of timber so old it had fossilized. And inside, sheltered from wind and weather, were the remains of civilization. Buildings, a well. Storage chambers carved into the mountain itself. It had been a city once, before the kingdom, before borders and crowns and all the machinery of power that pretended to be eternal. Now it was just bone, the skeleton of something humanity had tried and abandoned. Shadow Swift walked the perimeter, checked the walls, tested the gates. This place is solid, defensible. We could hold here for weeks if we had supplies. We don't have weeks. Varric set Elira down gently. She immediately curled up and fell asleep. We've got days at most before they find us. And when they do, stone walls won't matter. 600 against 12. The math doesn't work. So what's the play? Torvin was examining the gates, trying to figure out how to bar them properly. We die here? Maybe. Varric looked at his people, at the exhausted faces and bleeding hands and eyes that had seen too much. Or maybe we make them pay so badly for taking this place that they decide we're not worth the cost. Kara shook her head. You can't negotiate from weakness. They'll just wait us out, starve us, or set fires and smoke us out like rats. I'm not talking about negotiating. Varric's voice went cold. I'm talking about making an example, showing the kingdom that throwing people away creates monsters, and monsters don't beg, they bite. The storm broke near midnight, cleared to reveal stars so bright they looked artificial, and in the distance, down in the valleys they'd climbed through, Varric could see lights, hundreds of them, moving in precise formation. The garrison, closer than expected, moving faster than anyone thought possible. They'd reach the hollows by tomorrow night. Varric gathered his people in what had once been a great hall, now just empty stone and echoes. They stood in a circle, 12 of them, 13 counting Elira, who slept in the corner wrapped in every blanket they had. This is it. He didn't try to soften it. Tomorrow they come. Tomorrow we find out if rage is enough to beat training and numbers. I won't lie to you. Most of us will probably die. Maybe all of us. But before we do, we're going to teach them something. What? Shadow Swift's voice carried dark amusement. That dead kings still have teeth? That every person they threw away was someone who mattered, someone who had names and families and value beyond what they provided the crown. And when they write the histories of this, when they talk about the mad king who ran into the mountains with traitors and outlaws, I want them to remember that we made them bleed for every inch, that we refused to die quiet. Torvin stepped forward. I'm with you, been with you since you gave me a reason to stand up. Might as well die standing, Kara nodded. Come this far. Seems stupid to quit now. One by one they agreed, not with enthusiasm, not with hope, just with the grim acknowledgement that they'd made their choice and would see it through to whatever end waited. Varric felt it settle into his bones. The finality. The point where turning back stopped being possible, not because the path was gone, but because going forward had changed who you were too much to fit back into who you'd been. They spent the night preparing, set traps, positioned weak points to funnel attackers, gathered stones to drop from the walls, every advantage they could manufacture from nothing. Near dawn, Elira woke, found Varric standing on the walls watching the horizon. She climbed up beside him, sat close. Are we going to die? No preamble, no child's hope for comforting lies. Just the question. Probably. Varric kept his eyes on the distance, but not without making them regret killing us. She was quiet for a long time, then, I don't want you to die. I know. Will it hurt? I'll try to make it quick, for both of us. She took his hand. Her fingers were small, cold. They're bad people. The ones coming. Right? No. Varric's voice was tired. Most of them are just people, following orders, trying to survive, believing what they've been told about us, that we're dangerous, that we're threats to everything they know. Then why do we have to kill them? Because they'll kill us if we don't. Because the world doesn't care about fair or right, just about who's still standing when the dust settles. That's not a good answer. No, it's not. But it's the true one. He looked down at her. When you're queen, I don't want to be queen. You will be, whether you want it or not. And when you are, remember this. Remember that every order you give, every law you enforce, every decision you make, it lands on people who don't have power. People like us. Like Torvin and Kara and everyone down there preparing to die. They're not numbers. They're not resources. They're people who bleed and hurt and love, and they all matter just as much as you do. She leaned against him. I'll remember. Good. Because that's the only way any of this means anything. The sun rose red and angry, lit up the valley below where 600 soldiers had made camp. Varric could see their formations even from this distance, the precise organization of military force that had conquered nations. They'd be here by noon, maybe sooner. The wait was worse than the fight would be. Just standing there knowing it was coming, watching the army prepare with mechanical efficiency to end them. Varric used the time to write. Pulled out a scrap of paper and a charcoal pencil he'd been carrying. Wrote 3 letters, one to Ceres, short, just, "You were right about everything. Thank you for teaching me what mattered." One to Torvin's daughter, longer, about what her father had done, how he'd stood up, how he'd chosen to die useful. One to the kingdom. Not to the council, not to Theron, to the people who'd never hear it, but he wrote it anyway. About how systems that throw people away create the very monsters they fear. How power that can't tolerate dissent has already lost the thing that makes it worth having. He sealed them, gave them to Shadow Swift. If you survive, get these delivered. And if I don't, then they burn with everything else. The soldiers arrived at noon, spread out in formation that was honestly beautiful if you could appreciate the craft. 3 companies, each one moving like a single organism, shields locked, spears ready, discipline so perfect it looked choreographed. At the center rode someone in commander's armor, probably a noble. Someone who'd never missed a meal or worried about rent, leading people to kill other people over politics they didn't understand. Varric stood on the wall, made himself visible, felt every bow in that army track to him. 600 chances to die before the fight even started. The commander rode forward, stopped just outside arrow range, raised a speaking horn. Varric Draven, former king. You are charged with treason, kidnapping, murder, and rebellion against lawful authority. Surrender now, and you will be granted a quick death. Your followers will be enslaved but spared. The child will be returned unharmed to royal custody. You have 1 hour to comply. The voice carried across the distance, emotionless, procedural, like reading from a script. Varric let the silence stretch, then shouted back without a horn. His voice carried anyway. Trained from years of battlefield command. I have nothing to surrender. You want me? Come take me. But understand this. Every person who dies today, their blood is on your hands, not mine, yours, because you're following orders from men too coward to face me themselves. The terms are not negotiable. 1 hour. Then we attack. Good. Varric smiled. It was not a friendly expression. I was getting bored waiting. He turned his back, walked down from the wall, left the commander staring at empty battlements. Behind him, Torvin was shaking. Not from fear, from suppressed laughter. That was insane. You just spit in the face of an army. I know, felt good though. They gathered in the hall one last time. Checked weapons. Said things that needed saying. Torvin talked about his daughter. Kara mentioned a brother she hadn't seen in 20 years. Shadow Swift just sharpened her knives and hummed something that might have been a funeral dirge. Varric held Elira. This is going to be loud, scary. You stay in the deepest chamber. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Promise me. I promise. She held him tight. I love you, Papa. I love you too, Princess. More than anything. The hour passed like seconds, like years. Time doing that strange thing it does when you're counting down to violence. Then the horns sounded, and 600 soldiers marched on the hollows like judgment itself. The first wave hit the gates like thunder made solid. Varric felt it through the stone beneath his feet. The percussion of 600 soldiers moving in unison, shields locked, spears forward, the kind of coordinated assault that broke fortresses designed by military engineers. The hollows had been built by people who understood war, but it had been empty for centuries. Time had weakened what violence couldn't break. Already Varric could see cracks spreading through the ancient timber of the gates. They won't hold, Kara said beside him. She was tracking the assault with professional eyes. Maybe an hour. Less if they bring up the ram. Then we make that hour cost them everything. Varric looked down at his people positioned along the walls. 12 fighters against an army. The math was obscene, but math had stopped mattering somewhere back in the mountains when he'd chosen his daughter over his kingdom. The stones came first, not thrown by hand. Launched from siege engines, the soldiers had assembled with disturbing speed, rocks the size of a man's head arcing through the air, smashing into walls, into people. Torvin went down screaming when one caught his shoulder. The sound of breaking bone carried across the courtyard. Shadow Swift dragged him back, applied pressure to stop the bleeding, but his sword arm hung useless, one fighter down before they'd even engaged. "Return fire," Varric ordered. His people loosed arrows, most bounced off shields. A few found gaps. Soldiers fell. But for every one that dropped, 3 more filled the space. Perfect discipline. The kind that came from training that broke you down and rebuilt you as a component in a machine. The ram arrived. Massive trunk of timber capped with iron, carried by 20 men chanting in rhythm. They swung it back. Forward, into the gates with force that made the entire fortress shudder. Again. Again. Wood screamed. Metal hinges groaned. The gates that had stood for centuries were dying in real time. Varric counted the impacts, calculated how many more they could take, came up with a number that made his stomach drop. 5. Maybe 6. "Fall back to secondary positions," he shouted. "When those gates go, we funnel them into the courtyard. Kill zone. No mercy. No prisoners. We make them pay for every foot." His people moved, abandoned the walls, took positions behind makeshift barricades they'd constructed from rubble and timber. It was desperate, improvised, the kind of defense you used when you'd run out of good options and had to make do with terrible ones. The gates exploded inward on the 7th impact. Soldiers poured through like water breaking a dam. Shields up, formations tight. They moved with the confidence of overwhelming force, the certainty that comes from knowing you outnumber the enemy 50-1. Varric let them come, waited until the courtyard was packed with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, then gave the signal. His people dropped stones from the 2nd level, massive chunks of masonry that fell like judgment, crushed shields, broke formations, created chaos in what had been perfect order. Then the arrows came. Not volleys. Targeted shots. Shadow Swift putting shafts through eye slits and throat gaps with accuracy that looked supernatural. Kara firing so fast her bow was a blur. Soldiers went down. Others trampled them trying to advance. The tight formation that had been their strength became a trap. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't spread out, just pushed forward through a gauntlet of death. Varric joined the fight with his sword, dropped from the 2nd level into the press of bodies. Started killing with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years perfecting violence. He didn't think, didn't feel, just moved. Block, strike, step, every motion economical, every blow lethal. His blade found throats and joints and all the soft places where armor couldn't protect. A spear came at his face. He deflected it, drove his dagger up under the soldier's chin, felt the body go limp, moved on before it hit the ground. Another soldier, another kill. The pattern repeated until his arms burned and his lungs screamed and blood covered him like a second skin. This was what people didn't understand about combat. The philosophy fell away. The reasons stopped mattering. It just became motion and reaction. Your body executing training while your mind went somewhere else to avoid breaking under the weight of what you were doing. Varric had killed hundreds, maybe thousands, in wars and battles and all the conflicts that kingdoms claimed were necessary. He'd made peace with it the way soldiers do, by not looking too close, by telling himself it served something larger. But here, in this courtyard, surrounded by men dying for orders they probably didn't understand, the justifications felt obscene. These weren't enemies. They were just people unlucky enough to be standing between him and survival. He killed them anyway, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant Elira died alone. So he kept moving, kept killing. Became the monster the kingdom had always feared an alpha without restraint would become. The soldiers started retreating, not routed, just pulling back to regroup. They'd taken losses, 20 dead, maybe 30, enough to make them reconsider the frontal assault. Varric stood in the center of the courtyard, breathing hard, surrounded by corpses. His sword dripped red. His mind cataloged damage. 3 of his people down, 1 dead. The others wounded but functional. They'd survived the first wave, but waves were just time-buying tactics. Eventually the ocean wore down the shore. The commander rode forward again, this time closer, within range but protected by a wall of shields. He looked at the bodies, at Varric standing defiant in the middle of carnage. "You cannot win." His voice carried authority backed by mathematics. "You know this. Why sacrifice everyone for pride?" "This isn't pride," Varric's voice was hoarse, raw from shouting. "This is principle. You threw us away. Decided we didn't matter. Now you get to learn what discarded people do when they've got nothing left to lose. Noble speech. Doesn't change the outcome. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick. For all of you." Quick deaths. How generous. Varric laughed. It sounded unhinged even to his own ears. "Here's my counteroffer. You leave. Take your soldiers. Go back to Sovereign Reach. Tell them the Iron Alpha isn't begging anymore. Tell them the age of throwing people away is over." The commander shook his head. "You're insane." "Maybe. But I'm insane with a sword, and you're sane with orders from men too coward to face me. Which one of us is really broken?" There was no answer. The commander just turned his horse and rode back. 5 minutes later, the second wave came. But this time they brought fire. Flaming arrows arced over the walls, landed in buildings, in supplies, in anything that would burn. The hollows had been dry stone and old timber. Within minutes, sections of it were blazing. Smoke filled the courtyard, thick and choking. Vision reduced to shadows and flame. The soldiers advanced through it wearing wet cloth over their faces. Using the smoke as cover, Varric's people fought blind, stabbing at shapes in the haze, sometimes hitting soldiers, sometimes hitting nothing. The fire created chaos that favored numbers. And the soldiers had numbers to spare. Kara took a sword through the side, went down hard. Shadow Swift dragged her back while fighting off 3 soldiers simultaneously. Her blade work was poetry written in violence, but even poetry couldn't stop mathematics. They were losing, slowly, inevitably, being ground down by fire and numbers and the simple fact that 12 people couldn't hold against 600 no matter how skilled or desperate they were. Varric felt it happening. The moment where defeat stopped being theoretical and became concrete, where the outcome shifted from maybe to certainly. He was going to die here, and so was everyone with him. Then the horn sounded, not from the attacking force, from somewhere outside the fortress. A different note, higher pitched, urgent. The soldiers paused, confused. The commander rode back through the smoke, shouted orders. Varric couldn't hear. The assault stopped, pulled back. Formations reforming in the valley. Something had changed, but Varric couldn't see what. Shadow Swift climbed to a position where smoke didn't block her view. Came back down 3 minutes later. Her face was unreadable. "There's another force approaching, from the south. Maybe 200 soldiers, different banners. They're engaging the garrison." "What?" Varric's mind raced. "Who?" "Don't know, but they're buying us time. The garrison's splitting to face them. It made no sense. No one should be helping them. They'd been declared traitors, outlaws. Every hand turned against them, unless someone else had decided the kingdom needed enemies in positions of power. Varric made a decision that was probably stupid, but they were past the point where smart options existed. We push out. Hard. While they're divided, we break through their lines and we run. It's our only chance. That's suicide. Kara was still bleeding, could barely stand. They'll cut us down before we make 50 yards. Maybe. But dying running beats dying trapped. He looked at each of them, at the exhausted faces and wounded bodies and eyes that had seen too much. "We move in 5 minutes. Get Elira. Get anyone who can walk. Leave the rest." The words tasted like betrayal, but triage was just organized cruelty, choosing who lived by deciding who died. There was no moral high ground, just terrible choices and the will to make them. They gathered in the burning hall, 7 people still functional, Torvin with his shattered shoulder, Kara bleeding from her side, Shadow Swift moving like she'd broken ribs, the others battered and burnt and held together by stubbornness. Elira emerged from the deep chamber. Her eyes went wide at the carnage, at the bodies, at her father covered in blood and smoke. "Papa? We're leaving." He pulled her close. "Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say. Understand?" She nodded, too shocked to argue. They moved to the shattered gates. Varric checked the courtyard. Bodies everywhere, some theirs, most the kingdom's. The math of violence written in corpses. Beyond the gates, he could see the garrison in chaos, split between the fortress and the new threat. Formations broken, chain of command disrupted. It was the best chance they'd get. Probably the only chance. "On my mark." Varric gripped his sword. "We go fast. We go hard. Anyone falls, we keep moving. No heroics. No looking back. We survive or we die, but we do it together. 3 seconds. 2. 1. They charged. 7 wounded people and a child running directly at an army. It should have been suicide. Should have ended in seconds. But the confusion saved them. Soldiers didn't know where to focus. The fortress. The attacking force. The Mad King and his followers sprinting through their lines. By the time they organized a response, Varric's group had broken through the outer perimeter. They ran, through smoke and chaos, past soldiers fighting soldiers, past officers screaming contradictory orders, into the forest beyond where trees swallowed them and smoke obscured pursuit. Varric didn't stop, didn't slow, just kept moving until his lungs burned and his legs felt like water. Behind him he could hear the others, breathing hard, stumbling, but moving, a mile, 2, 3. Distance accumulating between them and death. Finally he called a halt. They collapsed, sprawled in underbrush, gasping, bleeding, alive, for now. Who attacked the garrison? Torvin managed between breaths. Who helped us? Don't know. Varric scanned the forest, checking for pursuit. But right now I don't care. They bought us life. We take it. They rested for 20 minutes, treated wounds with what little they had, counted losses. Of 12 who'd stood at the hollows, 7 remained. The rest were dead or captured. Another sacrifice on the altar of survival. The philosophy kept asking, at what point did the cost exceed the value? But philosophy was a luxury, and Varric had learned to travel light. They moved northwest, away from the garrison, away from the fortress, into deeper wilderness where maps ran out and civilization's certainty gave way to honest uncertainty. Near sunset, they found a stream, stopped to drink, to clean wounds that had started going septic. The water was cold enough to burn. Elira sat beside Varric, stared at nothing. Her face had gone past shock into something that looked like acceptance. The kind that came from realizing the world was worse than anyone had told you, and you had to live in it anyway. Papa. Her voice was small. Those soldiers, the ones who died, did they have families? Probably. Were they bad people? No. Just people following orders. Then why did you kill them? Because they would have killed us. Because in that moment, there was no right answer, just survival. He looked at her. This is what ruling means, Elira. Making choices where every option hurts someone, where there's no clean solution, just terrible mathematics and the will to choose anyway. I don't want to rule. I don't want that responsibility. You'll have it whether you want it or not, so you might as well learn to carry it. He touched her face gently. When you're queen, remember this. Every order costs someone. Every law breaks someone. Power is just organized violence with better marketing. And if you forget that, you become the thing I've been fighting against. She nodded. Didn't understand. Not fully. But understanding would come, usually when you least wanted it. Shadow Swift returned from scouting. Her face was grim. We've got a problem. Just one? Varric stood. His body protested. Everything hurt. Soldiers, behind us, maybe 10 of them, moving fast. Tracker hounds. How long? Hour, maybe less. Can we outrun them? Not in our condition. They're fresh. We're bleeding and exhausted. They'll run us down before midnight. Varric looked at his people, at the wounds and exhaustion and damage that no amount of will could overcome. They couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't fight. The mathematics had finally caught up. We split up. His voice was steady, even as his mind raced through scenarios that all ended badly. Shadow Swift, you take Elira. Move fast. No trail. Get her somewhere safe. No. Elira's voice was sharp. I'm not leaving you. You don't get a choice. This isn't negotiable. I won't go. You can't make me. Varric knelt in front of her, gripped her shoulders. Listen to me. You're the only thing that matters. Not me. Not them. You. Because you're going to live long enough to change everything we died trying to protect. But that only works if you survive. Understand? Tears streamed down her face, but she nodded. Good girl. He pulled her into a fierce hug. I love you. Always remember that. He handed her to Shadow Swift. The woman nodded once. Silent promise. She'd protect her, or die trying. They disappeared into the forest, Elira looking back until trees swallowed her. Varric turned to the others. We buy them time. We hold here. We make those 10 soldiers regret every step. That's suicide, Kara said, but her hand was already on her weapon. We're barely standing. I know, but standing's enough, has to be. They found a position, narrow gap between two ridges. Good sight lines. Defensible if you didn't care about retreat. They set what traps they could with failing light and exhausted bodies. Then waited. For dogs and death and whatever came after. The hounds found them as darkness fell, baying in the distance, getting closer. Behind them, the soldiers moved with professional efficiency. No rushing, no mistakes, just steady pressure closing the trap. Vaeric watched them come. Felt something settle in his chest. Acceptance, maybe. Or just exhaustion so deep that fear stopped registering. Here we go. He raised his sword. Last time, make it count. The soldiers entered the gap, cautious, shields up, expecting ambush. They got it. Vaeric's people hit them from both sides. Close quarters where numbers mattered less and desperation mattered more. Steel rang, men screamed, blood-painted stone. Vaeric killed 2 before a spear got through his guard, caught him high on the chest. Not deep, but enough to slow him, enough to hurt. He kept fighting, drove his blade through a soldier's throat, felt warm blood spray across his face, turned to face the next one. Kara went down, a sword through her leg. She kept swinging from the ground until a second blade finished her. Torvin charged with his one good arm, took 3 soldiers with him before they brought him down. He died cursing them, promising they'd burn. One by one, Vaeric's people fell, until it was just him, surrounded, bleeding, sword heavy in his hand. The soldiers circled, cautious. They'd lost 5, maybe 6. Not terrible odds, but they'd learned to respect this man who wouldn't die quiet. The officer stepped forward, young, maybe 30. He looked at Vaeric with something that might have been respect, might have been pity. It's over. Drop the weapon. We'll make it quick. Vaeric's laugh was broken. Ugly. Quick deaths. Everyone keeps promising those. Never quite deliver, though. You fought well. Died well. That's worth something. Worth nothing. Vaeric's grip tightened on his sword. Just means I'm good at violence. World doesn't need more of that. Then why keep fighting? Because stopping means admitting they were right. That I was wrong to choose one child over the kingdom. And I can't do that. Won't do that. Even knowing what it cost. The officer shook his head. Signaled his men. They closed in, spears ready, 4 of them, more than enough. Vaeric prepared to charge, to take as many with him as possible. To die the way he'd lived, fighting against odds that didn't matter because the alternative was surrender. Then someone spoke from the darkness behind the soldiers. A voice he knew. A voice that shouldn't be here. Stand down. The soldiers turned, confused. A figure emerged from shadow. Armor. Royal insignia. Authority written in posture and command. Lord Maelor Vane. Wounded from their encounter at Thornbreak Bridge. Arm in a sling, but alive. Very much alive. And not alone. Behind him came 24 soldiers, fresh, well-armed, moving with precision that spoke to elite training. Vaeric's mind tried to process it. Maelor here. With troops. In the wilderness, far from supply lines. It didn't make sense. Unless... The officer saluted Maelor. My lord, we have him contained. Good. Stand aside. I'll finish this personally. The soldiers backed away. Created space. Maelor walked forward slowly, each step measured. His eyes never left Vaeric. When he was close enough that his voice wouldn't carry, he spoke again. Different tone. Almost conversational. You should have killed me at the bridge. Probably. Vaeric's sword stayed ready. Add it to the list of mistakes. Maelor smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. You really don't understand, do you? Even now. Even here. You think this was about you running into the mountains, about you gathering outcasts, about the kingdom hunting a rogue king, wasn't it? No. This was about creating a monster, about pushing you past every line until you became exactly what we needed you to be. Vaeric felt cold spread through his chest. What? Think about it. Maelor's voice was patient. Teacher explaining to a slow student. We exile you. We threaten your daughter. We chase you into the wilderness. We force you to kill soldiers just doing their duty. And what happens? You become the nightmare. The Mad King who murders innocents. The dangerous alpha who proves exactly why people like you need to be controlled. Understanding hit like a physical blow. This was planned. All of it. From the start. Maelor's smile widened. The council vote. The banishment. Even the attack on Elira. We needed you gone. But more than that, we needed you gone in a way that justified everything we're about to do. What are you talking about? New laws. Passed while you've been playing revolutionary. Mandatory registration for all Omegas. Restricted movement. Enhanced oversight. All justified by the chaos and uncontrolled alpha created. You wanted to change the system? Congratulations. You made it worse. Every person like Ceres is now facing restrictions because you couldn't accept your exile quietly. Varric's sword trembled. His voice came out raw. You're lying. Am I? Think about the timeline. That force that attacked the garrison, that gave you a chance to escape. Where do you think they came from? Who do you think sent them? No. The word fell out. Denial. Rejection. We needed you to survive, to keep running, to keep killing. Every body you left behind was another story. Another justification. Another reason for people to be afraid of what happens when alphas don't accept their place. This was the moment. The twist. The thing he should have seen coming if he hadn't been blinded by rage and grief and the desperate need to believe his suffering meant something. He'd been a tool. From the beginning. Everything he'd done had served their purpose. The rebellion wasn't liberation. It was marketing. Theater designed to justify oppression. And he'd performed perfectly. Had done exactly what they needed. Had become the monster they could point to and say, see? This is why we need control. This is why freedom is dangerous. Where's Ceres? His voice broke. What did you do to her? Oh, she's quite comfortable. Under palace protection. Probably reading to your daughter right now. We never touched her. Why would we? She was the perfect bait. The reason you'd burn everything down. He leaned closer. She doesn't even know the role she played. Still thinks you abandoned the kingdom for her. Still believes this was about love. Varric's legs felt weak. Everything crumbling. You let me take Elira from the bridge. Let me kill your soldiers. All of it planned. Every step. Though I'll admit, you killed more than we expected. Made it more convincing. So thank you for the extra effort. The philosophy he'd built. The justifications. The belief that choosing family over empire meant something. All of it rotten at the foundation. He'd been dancing on strings the whole time. And the worst part was that people had died for it. Real people. Torvin with his dreams of his daughter. Kara with her bitter wisdom. Shadow Swift with her dark humor. All of them dead or dying for a lie he'd been too blind to see. Why tell me? His voice was barely a whisper. Why not just kill me? Because... Maelor's voice went cold. I want you to know. Want you to carry it. Every person who died because you couldn't accept losing. Every restriction passed because you proved alphas were dangerous. Every life made worse because you chose personal attachment over responsibility. That's your legacy. Not heroism, not love. Just arrogance dressed up as principle. Varric looked at his sword, at the blood covering it, at the bodies lying in the gap, at everything he'd destroyed while believing he was building something better. The weight finally broke him. Not physically, but something inside. The part that had held on to certainty. That had believed his choices were justified. That part shattered. And what emerged from the wreckage wasn't the Iron Alpha, or the exiled king, or the revolutionary father. Just a man who'd been played perfectly. Who'd let rage and love blind him to the larger game. You win. He dropped his sword. It clattered on stone. Sounded like everything ending. Do what you came to do. Maelor shook his head. I'm not going to kill you. That would make you a martyr. No, you're going back, to sovereign reach, to stand trial, to confess publicly that everything you did was wrong, that the council was right to remove you, that systems exist for good reasons, and tearing them down just creates chaos. And if I refuse, then Elira and Ceres pay the price. We'll make sure the kingdom knows they supported you, conspired with you. Every law we pass crushing their kind will make sure everyone knows it's because of them. Their names attached to the terror you created. It was perfect, brutal, and completely logical. They'd broken him not with torture or death, but by making his defiance hurt the people he'd fought for. This was what power looked like when it stopped pretending to be merciful. Just cold mathematics and the will to use leverage. 1 week. Maelor turned to leave. You have 1 week to reach sovereign reach, to compose your confession, to prepare to be the example that keeps everyone else in line. If you run, if you fight, if you do anything except what we've told you. He left the thread unfinished, didn't need to finish it. The soldiers bound his hands, not roughly, almost gently, like they understood he was already broken and physical restraint was just procedure. They led him away from the bodies, away from the people who died believing they were fighting for something that mattered. And Varric followed. Because what else could he do? He'd been given a choice between his pride and their lives, between dying defiant and living with the knowledge that every breath he took was bought by submission. There was no good answer, just the terrible mathematics of being played perfectly, of realizing too late that the game had never been about winning, just about making sure he lost in exactly the right way. As they walked through darkness, Varric understood something fundamental, something the philosophers never quite captured. Power doesn't break you by taking what you love. That just creates martyrs. People who die defiant and inspire others. Real power breaks you by making you complicit, by forcing you to choose between betraying your principles or betraying your family. And then making sure everyone knows you chose family, that you weren't strong enough to be the hero, just human enough to be controlled. They'd turned his love into his prison, his defiance into their justification, his every choice into proof that he was exactly what they'd always said he was. And the worst part was that he'd do it all again, would make the same choices, would sacrifice the same principles, because being a father meant more than being right. And Maelor had known that, had counted on it. That was the real lesson, the one that mattered. Systems didn't survive by being just or moral. They survived by understanding human weakness and exploiting it with surgical precision. And Varric had been the perfect subject, had demonstrated exactly how thoroughly love could compromise strength, how completely personal attachment could destroy political will. In 1 week, he'd stand before the kingdom and say everything they wanted him to say, would confess to madness and weakness and all the sins they'd carefully arranged for him to commit, would become the cautionary tale that justified every oppression to come. And he'd do it willingly, because the alternative was watching Elira and Cerys suffer for his pride. That was the point of no return. Not death, not defeat, but the moment where you understood that survival meant becoming complicit in your own destruction, where you chose to live as the thing you'd fought against because dying as yourself was a luxury you couldn't afford anymore. Varric walked through darkness toward a future where everything he'd believed would be proven wrong and everyone he'd loved would be safer for it. And the forest around him was silent, except for wind through trees and the sound of his own breathing and the quiet certainty that he'd just changed into someone he no longer recognized. The transformation was complete. Not dramatic, not heroic, just the slow erosion of principle under the weight of consequence, until nothing remained except survival and the terrible knowledge that sometimes surviving was its own kind of death. The chains were ceremonial, silver inlaid with gold, beautiful enough to hang in a museum, light enough that Varric could have snapped them with effort. But breaking them would trigger the contingency Maelor had explained in loving detail during the 3-day march back to Sovereign Reach. Archers positioned on rooftops, orders to shoot anyone in his vicinity, Elira first, then Cerys, then him if there was anything left worth killing. So he wore the chains, let them parade him through streets where people had once shouted his name. Now they threw garbage, screamed insults, called him traitor and madman and all the things the kingdom had spent 3 days teaching them to believe. The propaganda had been efficient, brutal. Every tavern told stories about the Iron Alpha's fall, how love had corrupted him, how an Omega woman had twisted his mind, how his rebellion had killed hundreds of innocents just trying to do their duty. None of it was technically false. That was the genius. They just removed context until truth became indistinguishable from the lie. Varric walked through it without expression, kept his eyes forward, let the crowd perform their hatred while his mind worked through scenarios that all ended the same way. In 6 hours, he'd stand before the Grand Council, would read the confession they'd written, would validate every law they planned to pass, would become the living proof that challenging power was madness, and Elira would be safe. Cerys would be safe. That was the trade, his dignity for their lives. The mathematics made sense. Cold, perfect, terrible. But mathematics had never accounted for the human variable, for the part of consciousness that would rather burn than bend. That understood surrender was just slow death with better marketing. Varric had felt that part die in the forest when Maelor explained the game, had accepted it, had walked into captivity believing it was over. He'd been wrong, because the thing about breaking someone completely is that it removes the last restraint, the part that hopes for better outcomes, that believes in redemption, that thinks playing by rules might eventually lead somewhere worth going. Strip that away, and what remains is dangerous in ways power can never quite predict. A man with nothing left to lose isn't rational, isn't controllable, is just consequence waiting for an opportunity. And Varric had spent 3 days pretending to be broken while his mind rebuilt itself into something the council wouldn't recognize until too late. They brought him to the palace dungeons, not the public cells where common criminals rotted, the private chambers reserved for political prisoners, stone walls, narrow window, bed that was almost comfortable. Even in imprisonment, class distinctions mattered. The guard who locked him in was young, nervous. He fumbled with the keys, avoided eye contact, probably his first time guarding someone who'd been king. "What's your name?" Varric asked. The guard flinched. "Sir, I'm not supposed to... I'm not king anymore. Not giving orders. Just asking a question." The guard hesitated. Then, Marcus Vell. "You from the city?" "No." "Outer provinces. Farm country. Joined the guard to send money home." Varric nodded. Sat on the bed. The chains clinked. "You got family? Brother, sister, parents if they're still alive? Haven't been back in 2 years. What do they grow?" "Wheat mostly. Some barley. Barely enough to pay taxes and eat." The guard realized he was talking. Probably more than he should. His face went red. "I should go. Check the perimeter. Before you do, tell me something. That confession I'm supposed to read tomorrow. You think it's true?" Marcus froze, hand on the door. "Not my place to think about politics, sir. I'm not asking about politics. I'm asking if you believe an alpha can go mad from loving the wrong person, if you think choosing family over duty makes someone dangerous." The guard's jaw worked. He looked at the door, at Varric, at the chains. "My brother loved a man," he said quietly. "In the provinces, they don't allow that. Said it was unnatural. Went against proper hierarchy. They arrested him, beat him, sent him to re-education camps. He killed himself rather than go." Varric's chest tightened. "I'm sorry. You asked what I believe." Marcus met his eyes. "I believe men who decide what love is acceptable are the dangerous ones, not the people doing the loving." He left quickly, like he'd said too much, like honesty was its own kind of treason. Varric sat in silence. Let the words settle. Let them add weight to what he'd already decided. The game Maelor was playing depended on Varric staying predictable, staying broken, reading the confession, validating the system, playing his role in the theater. But theater required cooperation. And Varric had just remembered something fundamental about his nature, something 20 years of kingship had buried under responsibility and caution. He'd never been good at taking orders, even when they made sense, especially when they made sense. The philosophy professors would call it pathological. This refusal to submit even when submission was the rational choice, would diagnose it as ego or pride or some character flaw that needed correcting. But it wasn't any of those things. It was simpler, more honest. Some people were built to bend, to accept that sometimes losing was winning if you survived, to understand that compromise was how civilization functioned. Varric wasn't one of them, never had been, had just learned to perform the act, to pretend he could be the reasonable one, the diplomatic one, the king who balanced competing interests. That performance had ended in the forest, and what emerged from the wreckage was the thing he'd been before crowns and ceremony taught him to be civilized. Just an alpha who'd counted the people who mattered and decided everyone else was negotiable. The narrow window showed sunset, red and angry, painting the city in colors that looked like warning. Varric examined the chains, studied the locks. The mechanisms were good but not perfect. Palace smiths made them ceremonial instead of functional. Assumed psychology would hold prisoners better than steel. They'd assumed wrong. He worked on the lock with a piece of wire he'd palmed from Marcus's keyring. The kid had been too nervous to notice, too busy avoiding eye contact to see the small theft. 10 minutes of careful pressure and the lock clicked open. The chains fell away. Varric rubbed his wrists, felt circulation return, felt something else return too. Agency, choice, the fundamental human right to decide how your own story ended. He moved to the door, listened. Guards outside. Footsteps in regular patterns. Shift change would be in 3 hours. That's when he'd move, when attention was divided and discipline was at its weakest. Until then, he prepared, tore strips from the bedsheet, made crude bandages, wrapped his knuckles, small things. But violence was just accumulated small things delivered with enough force to break bones. He'd learned that at 15. First real fight. Farmer's son twice his size. Varric had lost teeth, broken his nose. Won anyway because he'd been willing to keep hitting long after the other kid quit. That willingness was what made alphas dangerous. Not strength, not speed, just the refusal to accept that the fight was over until someone stopped breathing. The kingdom had built systems to contain that, to channel it into military service, to make it productive instead of destructive. Had believed that giving alphas crowns and purpose would domesticate the violence. But domestication was just a mask. And masks came off when you pushed hard enough. Maelor had pushed, had stripped away everything civilized, had reduced Varric to base components, and then expected him to stay broken. That was his mistake. The thing he hadn't calculated. Broken things could still cut. Footsteps approached. Keys jangled. The door opened. Different guard. Older. Carried himself like someone who'd seen combat. Brought food on a tray. Eat. Tomorrow's a long day. Want you healthy for the confession. Varric took the tray. Studied the guard. Watched how he moved, where he kept his weapons. The small tells that showed training and weakness. The guard noticed. Smiled without humor. Don't even think about it. I've put down men bigger than you. I don't doubt it. Varric set the tray aside. Question. That confession tomorrow. You'll be there? Everyone will be there. Biggest political event in decades. Mad King admitting he was wrong. Council finally vindicated. What if I don't read it? The guard's smile widened. Then they kill the Omega woman in front of you. Make you watch. Then the girl. Then you after you've had time to really understand what your pride cost. We got orders, detailed ones. You step off script even once, people start dying. Efficient. Varric's voice was calm, almost conversational. Must take a special kind of person to kill children on command. I don't make policy, just enforce it. The guard moved toward the door. Eat, sleep. Tomorrow you get to be part of history. Already am. Question is what kind. The guard left, locked the door. Footsteps fading down the corridor. Varric sat with the food. Didn't eat. His stomach was too tight, too full of what he was about to do. About the consequences that would ripple from the choice. Because there was no scenario where this ended well. No version where everyone survived. The mathematics were clear. Brutal. Final. He could read the confession, save Elira and Ceres, validate every oppression to come, live as the cautionary tale, die slowly of shame and self-hatred while watching the kingdom grind people into components. Or he could fight. Reject the script. Force them to kill him publicly and hope that his defiance inspired something, that it showed people what resistance looked like even when it was hopeless. Both options were terrible. Both required sacrifice. But one let him die as himself. And that was starting to matter more than survival. The philosophers would call this irrational, would point out that living prisoners could escape, could wait for better opportunities, could play the long game. But Varric had played the long game, had been patient and diplomatic and reasonable, had believed that working within systems was how you changed them, and it had gotten him exiled, betrayed, turned into a weapon against the people he'd tried to protect. So maybe the philosophers were wrong. Maybe patience was just cowardice with better branding. Maybe the long game was what people played when they weren't willing to pay the short-term cost of actual resistance. That realization settled into his bones like ice, changed something fundamental about how he saw the world, about what mattered. He'd spent 20 years trying to be the good king, the just ruler, the man who balanced competing interests and made decisions for the greater good. And none of it mattered, because systems didn't reward goodness. They rewarded compliance. punish deviation, ground everyone into identical shapes that fit their machinery. So being good was pointless. Being just was pointless. The only thing that mattered was being willing to break the machine even if it killed you. That was the lesson. The one Maylor had accidentally taught by pushing too hard, by assuming broken men stayed broken. 3 hours passed like heartbeats, fast and irregular. Varric used the time to center himself, to remember what combat felt like. The rhythm of violence, the way time stretched and compressed, the calm that came from accepting death as outcome. He'd felt it before. In battles where the odds were suicide and victory meant living long enough to see tomorrow. In duels where one mistake meant bleeding out on stone. In all the moments where being afraid would get you killed, so you just turned fear into fuel. This was different, worse, because he wasn't fighting for territory or honor or any abstract concept. Was fighting for the right to die on his own terms. To refuse the script even knowing what it would cost. That was the thing about dignity. It was cheap when things were easy, cost everything when things were hard. Most people couldn't afford it. Chose survival, chose submission, chose to live as whatever the system needed them to be. Varric understood that choice, didn't judge it, but couldn't make it himself. Whatever he was, whatever had survived kingship and exile and Maylor's manipulation, it couldn't bend anymore. Was just rigid principle waiting to break. The shift change came. Footsteps. Voices. Confusion as guards traded positions and information. 30 seconds where attention was divided. Varric moved. Picked the lock again. Slipped into the corridor. Moved quiet. Every sense heightened, tracking sound and shadow and the small disturbances that showed human presence. 2 guards at the end of the hall, talking, distracted. He came up behind them fast, hit the first one in the throat, collapsed his windpipe before he could shout. The second one turned, got an elbow in the temple, went down hard, unconscious before he understood what happened. Varric took their weapons, sword, dagger. The familiar weight settled something in his chest, made him feel complete for the first time in days. He moved through corridors he'd walked as king, everything familiar. Everything changed, guards everywhere, palace on high alert, but they were looking for external threats, not for the prisoner moving through their midst like he belonged. Confidence was the best disguise. Walk like you're supposed to be somewhere, and people assumed you were. He found the east wing where they'd housed Ceres and Elira. Separate rooms, guards outside each. More than he could take in a straight fight. Had to be smart. Had to use terrain and surprise and the fact that they weren't expecting him. A servant came around the corner. Young woman, carrying linens. She saw him. Her eyes went wide. Mouth open to scream. Varric grabbed her, hand over her mouth, pulled her into an alcove. She struggled. He held her still, waited for her to stop fighting. "I'm not going to hurt you." His voice was quiet, calm. "But I need you to stay silent. Can you do that?" She nodded, eyes huge, terrified. "Good." He released her slowly. "What's your name?" "Lyra." Her voice shook. "Lyra, I need to reach the rooms at the end of this hall, the ones with guards. Can you help me?" "Why would I help you?" "You're the traitor, the mad king." "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just a father trying to reach his daughter before they kill her to prove a point. You decide which story makes more sense." She stared at him, processing. Then, "They're going to kill a child? If I don't read their confession tomorrow?" "Yes. They'll kill her. They'll kill the woman with her. They'll call it necessary. They'll say it was my fault for not cooperating. That's insane. Welcome to how power actually works." Varric's voice was tired. No philosophy, no moral high ground, just men doing terrible things and calling it necessary. Lyra's face did something complicated. Fear and disgust and calculation all mixed together. "I can distract the guards. Tell them there's a disturbance in the kitchens. They'll send one to check. Maybe 2. That help?" "More than you know. Why are you doing this?" "Because I've got a daughter too. And if someone told me I had to let her die to prove a point..." She trailed off, shook her head. "I'd burn this whole city down first." She left. Varric watched her approach the guards, saw her gesture frantically, point toward the kitchens. The guards hesitated, discussed. 2 of them broke off. headed toward the disturbance. That left 2. Still too many, but better odds. Varric walked forward like he belonged, confident, no hesitation. The guards saw him too late, were reaching for weapons when he was already moving. He killed the first one. Fast. Efficient. Blade through the ribs, no time for mercy. The second one got his sword up, blocked, countered. Good technique, professional training. They traded blows that rang through the corridor like bells announcing violence. Varric was faster, meaner, fought like someone who'd already died and was just finishing business. He drove his blade through the guard's throat, felt the body go heavy. Let it drop. Behind him, footsteps. The other 2 guards returning, they saw the bodies. Saw him. Started shouting. Varric kicked open Ceres's door. She was standing by the window, turned at the noise. Her face when she saw him went through shock to understanding to something that might have been love or might have been grief for what he'd become. "We need to go, now." He grabbed her hand. "Where's Elira?" "Next room." "But Varric, they'll kill us. They'll—" "I know. Come on." They burst into Elira's room. She was sitting on the bed reading, looked up, saw her father covered in blood, holding a sword. Ceres behind him looking terrified. "Papa?" "Time to leave, princess." He picked her up, held her with one arm, kept the sword in the other. "We're ending this tonight." "Ending what?" "Everything." They ran, through corridors filling with guards, alarms ringing, the palace transforming from home to battlefield in seconds. Varric cut down anyone who got close. Didn't slow, didn't hesitate, just moved with singular focus toward the only exit that mattered. The throne room, where the council would gather for tomorrow's confession, where Maelor would be waiting because men like him couldn't resist watching their plans succeed. They crashed through the doors. The hall was empty except for one person, Maelor standing near the throne, smiling, like he'd expected this, like he'd planned for it. "Of course." His voice carried across the empty space. "The Mad King makes one last desperate play. How predictable." Varric set Elira down, pushed her and Ceres behind him. "Where's the council?" "Nearby. Waiting. We knew you'd try something. You're an alpha. You can't help yourself." So we prepared contingencies. The doors behind them slammed shut, locked. The doors on all sides closing, sealing them in. And from hidden alcoves, soldiers emerged, dozens of them, surrounding, weapons ready. Varric's heart hammered. He'd counted on surprise, on catching them unprepared, but they'd expected this, had prepared for it, had turned his last act of defiance into just another part of their script. Last chance. Maelor walked closer. "Read the confession. Live as the broken king, or watch them die and then die yourself, knowing you could have saved them." Varric looked at Ceres, at Elira, at the fear in their eyes, at the trust they still held despite everything, despite knowing this was probably where it ended. Then he looked at Maelor and smiled. It was his father's smile, the one he'd seen once when a tax collector tried to take their last cow, right before his father had broken the man's jaw with a shovel. "Here's what you don't understand about people like me." Varric's voice was calm, almost gentle. "You think love is our weakness, our vulnerability, the thing you exploit to make us controllable. But you're wrong. Love is what makes us dangerous, because once we've decided who matters, everyone else becomes acceptable loss, including ourselves. Then you're a fool." Maelor signaled the soldiers. "Kill them. All of them. Make it slow." The soldiers advanced, shields locked, spears forward, professional, disciplined, overwhelming. Varric raised his sword, felt Ceres and Elira against his back, felt his heart beating steady despite the mathematics, despite knowing this was how it ended. And then the windows exploded inward, glass and stone and chaos as figures crashed through from outside. 20 of them, 30, moving fast, hitting the soldiers from behind, breaking their formation, creating confusion where there had been order. Shadow Swift led them, alive, bloody but functional. Behind her came others. Faces Varric recognized, people from the settlements, the forgotten territories, the places the kingdom had thrown away. They'd followed him, had tracked him to sovereign reach, had waited for the moment when defiance mattered most. "Thought you killed us all." Shadow Swift's voice carried dark humor. "Thought we'd just let you die alone? You really don't understand us." The throne room erupted into violence. Soldiers fighting rebels, rebels fighting soldiers. Maelor screaming orders that no one could hear over the chaos. Steel ringing, blood spraying. The palace's pristine marble turning into an abattoir. Varric joined the fight. Not leading, not commanding, just another body in the press. Another blade cutting through the machinery of power. He killed soldiers who were just doing their duty. Killed them efficiently. Without hesitation. Without remorse. Because hesitation was luxury. Remorse was luxury. Everything except survival was luxury, and luxuries got you killed. Maelor retreated toward the throne, pulled something from his coat, a signal horn, blew it. The note cut through combat, and from corridors more soldiers came, fresh, professional. The palace guard, elite fighters. The mathematics shifted. Rebels were good, desperate and skilled. But numbers were numbers. The palace had hundreds more soldiers, could reinforce indefinitely, could grind them down through pure attrition. Varric saw it happening, saw his people falling, saw the tide turning, saw the moment where defiance stopped being dramatic and became just suicide with witnesses. But that had always been the point. Not to win, just to show that some people wouldn't bend, wouldn't break, would die fighting rather than live as examples of what happened when you challenged power. He fought his way to Maelor, cut through guards who tried to stop him, took wounds that would probably be fatal if he lived long enough to bleed out. Reached the throne where the High Chancellor stood, smiling like this was entertainment. "You lose," Maelor's voice was certain. "Even if you kill me, even if you slaughter everyone here, the kingdom endures, the laws pass. Everything you fought against happens anyway. Your death means nothing." Varric drove his blade into Maelor's stomach, felt it punch through silk and flesh, watched the smile fade into shock and pain and understanding that philosophy didn't matter when you were dying. "Maybe." Varric's voice was quiet, just between them. "But at least I'll die knowing I tried. That's more than you get." He pulled the blade free. Let Maelor collapse, turned to face the soldiers closing in. 50 of them, maybe more, all converging on this one spot. Cerys was beside him suddenly, holding a sword she'd taken from a dead soldier. Illyra behind her, protected. Shadow Swift on his other side, bloodied, grinning like this was the best day of her life. "Together," Cerys said. "However this ends." "However it ends," Varric agreed. The soldiers charged. One final wave, one last attempt to break them, to prove that power always won. That defiance was just theater before the inevitable submission. And Varric raised his sword, felt his heartbeat steady, felt clarity that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was willing to die for. The throne room filled with violence, with screams and steel and all the sounds of civilization's mask falling away to reveal the brutal mathematics underneath. And somewhere in the chaos, as blades fell and blood flowed and the kingdom learned exactly what happened when you push discarded people past the point of caring about survival, Varric understood something fundamental. This was always where it led. From the moment they exiled him, from the moment they threatened his family, from the moment they assumed love made him controllable instead of dangerous. Power could win 1,000 battles, could break 1,000 rebellions, could write history however it wanted, but it couldn't erase the moment. This moment. When people looked at the machinery and said no. When they chose death over submission. When they proved that some things mattered more than survival. And that moment, however briefly it existed, changed everything. Made every law passed afterward taste like ash. Made every victory feel incomplete. Made power understand that control was always temporary and consent was always provisional, and authority was just violence with better marketing. The blade came at him from his blind side. He turned too slow, felt steel bite deep, felt his leg collapse. Went down hard, vision blurring. Above him, the fight continued. Around him, people died for something they'd probably never see completed. Beside him, Cerys fought like fury incarnate. And beyond it all, the kingdom watched its clean marble halls turn into proof that throwing people away created exactly the monsters it feared most. Varric's vision went dark at the edges, his grip on the sword weakening, his body finally giving out after days of pushing past every limit. But he was smiling, because win or lose, live or die, he'd refused the script, had forced them to kill him instead of breaking him, Had shown Elira and anyone watching that dignity mattered more than survival. That was legacy. Not the crown, not the conquered territories, not the years of diplomatic victories. Just this, the refusal, the defiance, the absolute certainty that some prices were too high to pay no matter what they bought. The throne room's ceiling was painted with stars and wolves and all the mythology of power. Varric stared up at it, felt his heartbeat slowing, felt everything fading except one thought. He'd been a terrible king, a failed revolutionary, a weapon turned against his own cause. But he'd been a good father, a loyal friend, a man who chose love over empire and meant it. And in the end, when philosophy and politics and all the grand theories fell away, maybe that was the only measurement that mattered. His vision went dark, the sounds of combat fading. Somewhere nearby, Elira was screaming his name. Cerys was shouting orders. Shadow Swift was laughing that broken laugh that meant she knew they were all about to die. And Varric let go. Let the darkness take him. Let consequence arrive without resistance. Because he'd done what he came to do. Had refused to the end. Had shown that power's greatest fear was justified. That some people would rather burn than bend. And burning changed everything. Consciousness returned like drowning in reverse. Varric surfaced through layers of darkness that felt solid, heavy. Each breath dragged through lungs that didn't want to work. His body screamed damage reports from a dozen places where steel had found meat. But he was breathing, which meant he wasn't dead, which raised the immediate question of why not. He opened his eyes. Ceiling above him was wrong. Not the throne room's painted mythology, just plain stone, cold, functional. The kind of ceiling you saw in places built for practicality instead of grandeur. He tried to move. His body refused. Everything below his neck felt distant, disconnected, like his consciousness was piloting a machine that had stopped taking commands. Panic flared, then discipline crushed it. Panic was useless. Assessment mattered. Understanding where you were and why you were still alive. A face appeared above him. Old man, gray beard, eyes that had seen too much, physician probably. The kind who worked on people who weren't supposed to survive but did anyway through stubbornness or bad luck. Don't move. The old man's voice was gravel and smoke. You've got more holes than a fishing net. Moving opens them. Bleeding out in my care reflects poorly on my skills. Where am I? Somewhere between alive and dead. The physician checked bandages Varric couldn't feel. Which side you end up on depends entirely on whether you can follow simple instructions. My daughter, Cerys. Where are they? Alive. For now, though that situation remains fluid. The word fluid carried weight. Meaning, things were still happening. The fight hadn't ended when he went down. The story was still being written. How long? 3 days. You've been unconscious, probably for the best. The screaming gets tedious. Varric tried to catalog damage through sensation. His left leg was wrong. Angle didn't match memory. Probably shattered. His ribs felt like knives with each breath. The wound in his side pulsed heat that suggested infection setting up shop. He should be dead. The mathematics were clear, blood loss, trauma, 3 days without proper care in a palace that wanted him executed. So why wasn't he? The door opened. Shadow Swift entered. She looked worse than he felt. Arm in a sling, face swollen, moving like every step cost. But alive. Impossibly alive. You're awake. She pulled a chair over, sat with the careful motion of someone holding broken parts together through will. Good. We need to talk before you die or they kill you, whichever comes first. What happened? After you went down? We lost, obviously. They had too many soldiers, too much backup. We killed maybe 70, lost 30 of ours. The math never worked. Then why am I breathing? Because your daughter made a choice. Shadow Swift's voice was flat, exhausted. While you were bleeding out, while Cerys was trying to hold your guts in, Elira walked up to the ranking officer. 9 years old, covered in your blood, and she made them an offer. Varric's chest tightened. What offer? That she'd cooperate, would read whatever confession they wanted, would validate every law, would become the perfect captive princess. But only if they saved you, if they got you medical care, if they let you live long enough to see her one more time. No. The word came out broken. She shouldn't have. She's your daughter. What did you expect? Shadow Swift leaned forward. Pain flickered across her face. You taught her that family mattered more than everything, that you'd burn the world for the people you loved. So she did the same thing. Burned her future to buy you 3 more days of breathing. Where is she now? Under guard. In some tower where they keep royal prisoners. Ceres is with her. They're letting them stay together. Small mercy before they decide what to do with them. And me? You're the problem they're still solving. Can't execute you publicly after your daughter begged for your life. Makes them look cruel, but can't let you live because you're proof that their system creates the exact monsters it fears. So they're debating. Council's been in session for 2 days straight trying to figure out how to kill you without looking like villains. Varric tried to laugh. It came out wet. Wrong. They should just do it. I'm already dead. Just taking a while to finish. Maybe. But you're not finished yet. And that terrifies them. The physician returned, shoved Shadow Swift out, started checking wounds with hands that were surprisingly gentle for someone who looked like he wrestled bears for entertainment. You'll live. His voice carried certainty and regret in equal measure. The leg's gone. Won't walk right again. The ribs will heal crooked. You'll hurt every day for whatever time remains. But you'll live. Whether that's blessing or curse, I leave to philosophers. He left. Door closing with finality that suggested Varric was alone again, except for pain and consciousness. But he wasn't alone. The door opened minutes later. Different person. Young, familiar. Marcus. The guard who'd talked about his brother. He carried no weapons. Moved quiet. Checked the corridor before closing the door. Sir. His voice was barely above whisper. I'm not supposed to be here. Then why are you? Because what your daughter did. What she sacrificed. It's all anyone's talking about. Guards, servants, people in the streets. They're saying she loves you enough to trade her freedom for your life. That even after everything, even after you became the monster they called you, she still chose you. Varric's throat tightened. That's not love. That's a child making a terrible choice because I didn't teach her better. Maybe. Marcus sat in the chair Shadow Swift had vacated. Or maybe it's exactly what you taught her. That the people who matter are worth any cost. That systems don't get to decide who deserves protection. That love isn't weakness, it's the line you draw and dare the world to cross. Pretty words. Doesn't change outcome. No, but it changed people. Marcus leaned forward. I've served the palace for 6 years, followed orders, believed what they told me about hierarchy and necessity. Thought men like you were dangerous because you refused to accept your place. But watching your daughter stand there covered in your blood, begging them to save a man they called traitor. Watching her choose you over her own freedom, it made me question everything they taught me. One person questioning isn't revolution. No, but I'm not alone. Marcus's voice dropped even lower. There are others. Guards who saw what happened, who watched your people fight knowing they'd die, who heard your daughter make that choice. We're talking. In barracks. In corridors when officers aren't listening, and we're asking questions we never asked before. Varric studied the young man's face, saw belief there, raw, uncertain, the kind that came from watching your world crack and seeing something different through the gaps. What questions? About who decides what's acceptable, about whether following orders is the same as doing right, about whether a system that requires killing 9-year-olds' fathers to maintain itself deserves maintaining. Marcus stood. I don't have answers. None of us do. But we're asking. And that's more than we did before you came back. He left, quiet as he'd entered, like a ghost carrying questions that would outlive whatever answer the council reached about Varric's execution. And Varric lay there understanding something fundamental about how change actually happened. Not through grand gestures or perfect philosophy, just through accumulating small doubts, small questions, small moments where people looked at the machinery and wondered if maybe there was a better way. He'd failed at revolution, had been manipulated, outmaneuvered, broken, and used as justification for exactly what he'd fought against. By every measure that mattered, he'd lost completely. But losses were strange things. Sometimes they planted seeds in soil that victory never reached. Sometimes dying badly accomplished more than winning cleanly ever could. The days blurred, pain, medication, brief moments of clarity between longer stretches where his mind went somewhere else to avoid the body's damage. Physicians worked on him with skill that suggested someone important wanted him alive long enough for something. Shadow Swift visited twice more. Brought news. The council had passed the laws. Mandatory registration for Omegas, movement restrictions, enhanced surveillance. Everything Maelor had promised, using Varric's rebellion as justification for every cruelty they'd planned. But resistance was spreading. Not organized, not coordinated. Just people refusing in small ways, guards who looked the other way, citizens who hid unregistered Omegas, merchants who funded underground networks, all the tiny acts of defiance that added up to something bigger than philosophy. The system had won, but victory was costing more than they'd calculated. Every enforcement required soldiers, every crackdown created more dissent, every execution turned quiet doubters into active resistors. Varric listened, understood. The thing about crushing rebellions was that it taught people how to rebel better next time, showed them what worked and what didn't, created a curriculum in resistance that no amount of propaganda could erase. On the 7th day, they brought Elira. She entered escorted by 4 guards, who looked uncomfortable. Like bringing a child to see her dying father violated something they couldn't quite articulate. They positioned themselves at the walls, far enough to give privacy, close enough to prevent escape. Elira stood at the door, just stood there, looking at him, at the bandages and the wasted body, and the man who'd been king reduced to broken components. Then she ran, crossed the room fast, climbed onto the bed carefully, buried her face against his chest, sobbed like the child she was, but had been forced to stop being. Varric wrapped his good arm around her, held her while she cried. His own eyes burned, but he didn't let tears fall. Not because of pride, just because he needed to be solid for her, needed to be the thing she could break against without shattering. "I'm sorry." Her voice was muffled, broken. "I'm sorry I made the deal. I know you would have rather died. I know I should have let you, but I couldn't. I couldn't watch you die. Listen to me." His voice was rough, damaged. "You made the right choice, the only choice, and I'm grateful for it. But you said dignity mattered more than survival. You said I was wrong." He stroked her hair, felt how thin she'd gotten, how much the week had cost her. "Dignity is easy when you're the one dying, hard when you're the one left behind. You chose life for both of us. That took more courage than anything I did. They're going to kill you anyway," the guards told me, after I read the confession, after they used my cooperation to justify the laws. "They'll execute you quietly, say you died from wounds, make it look natural." I know. Then why am I doing this? Why am I reading their words if it doesn't save you? Because it buys time. And time is the only weapon we have left. Every day I breathe is another day for doubts to spread, for questions to accumulate, for the cracks in their certainty to widen. Your cooperation isn't surrender. It's strategic. It's playing the long game when the short game is already lost. She pulled back, looked at him with eyes too old for 9. "You really believe that?" "No." He smiled. "It hurt. But I'm telling you anyway because hope is what keeps you alive long enough to see if I'm wrong. And someone needs to survive this. Someone needs to remember what we tried to do, even if we failed." The door opened. Saris entered. She looked like she'd aged a decade, lines on her face that hadn't been there before. Gray in her hair that might have been stress or might have been grief. She dismissed the guards with a gesture that surprised Varric. They left. Actually left. Like she had authority here. She sat on the bed, took his hand. Her grip was strong, certain. Everything about her posture said she'd made a decision and meant to see it through. "I made them a deal." Her voice was steady, cold, clinical. The voice of someone who'd calculated costs and chosen the least terrible option. "They let you live. Really live. Not execution, not quiet murder. You get exile. Real exile. To the far territories. With me. With Elira. We leave Valor. We never come back. And in exchange, I validate everything. I become their proof that even Omegas agree the new laws are necessary. That control is safety. That everything you fought against was just one man's madness." Varric stared at her. Processing. "You'd do that? Become their symbol? For your life?" "Yes. For Elira's future." "Absolutely. I've spent my whole existence being what other people needed me to be. One more performance won't kill me, but watching you die would. The guards won't accept that. The council already did. Ceres's smile was bitter. Turns out having an Omega woman publicly denounce your rebellion is better propaganda than executing you, shows that even the people you fought for think you were wrong, and your death becomes footnote instead of martyrdom. She'd negotiated, had taken everything he'd fought for and traded it away to buy survival, had become complicit in crushing the very freedom she represented. It should have felt like betrayal, like everything falling apart, but Varric just felt tired, too damaged to be angry, too exhausted to argue philosophy when practicality had already won. When? His voice was barely audible. 3 days. After I read my statement, after Elira reads her confession. We leave. They escort us to the border, give us supplies, enough to start over somewhere the kingdom doesn't reach. And then we're gone. Erased. Like we never mattered. Elira was crying again. Silent tears. The kind that came from understanding the world was crueler than any child should have to learn. Varric pulled them both close, held them, felt their warmth, their breathing, the proof that they were alive and would stay that way. Everything he'd believed had been wrong. Every choice he'd made had backfired. Every principle he'd died for had been turned into weapon against itself. But they were alive. And maybe that was the only victory that actually mattered, not the grand philosophical statements, not the resistance or defiance or proof that some prices were too high, just the simple animal survival of the people you loved. The 3 days passed like years compressed. Ceres read her statement in the grand hall, voice steady, words damning. She called Varric misguided, called his rebellion the proof that love without control became destructive, validated every law, every restriction, every fear. The kingdom loved it, proof from the very person he'd tried to protect. Evidence that even Omegas understood their place when they weren't being manipulated by dangerous alphas. Elira read her confession next. 9 years old, standing in front of the council, saying she'd been kidnapped, coerced, that her father's love had been twisted by madness, that she was grateful to be rescued. Her voice never wavered. But Varric, watching from a wheeled chair in the shadows, saw her hands shake, saw the cost of every word, saw his daughter learning what survival required and hating it, but doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. That was his legacy. Not the rebellion, not the defiance, just teaching his child that sometimes living meant lying. That dignity was luxury, that the world didn't reward heroism, just negotiated survival. They left at dawn, escorted by 50 soldiers, moving slow because Varric couldn't ride and the wheeled chair didn't travel well over rough ground, heading northeast, toward territories so remote the kingdom's authority was just rumor. Shadow Swift met them at the border, alone, wounded but functional. She handed Varric a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Letters. Her voice was quiet. From people who watched what happened, who were changed by it, who wanted you to know that failure looks different depending on where you're standing. He took it, didn't open it, just held the weight. The proof that something had mattered even if he couldn't see how. You gonna be all right? He asked. Probably not. But I'll survive. That's what we do. She looked at Ceres, at Elira, at the small family heading into permanent exile. Take care of them. That's the war that matters now. She disappeared back toward the kingdom, back toward whatever resistance was building in the cracks his failure had created. They traveled for weeks, through forests and mountains and country that had never heard of Violor or kingdoms, or any of the philosophy that had consumed Varric's life. They found a settlement, small, remote, people who asked no questions and expected none answered. They built a house, small thing, wood and stone, nothing like palaces. But it was theirs, bought with survival instead of inheritance. Varric healed slowly. The leg never worked right. He walked with a cane, looked like an old man at 45. But he was breathing, watching Elira grow, seeing Ceres smile again. Small victories purchased with every grand ambition he'd ever held. At night, when pain kept him awake, he read the letters Shadow Swift had given him. Stories from people across the kingdom, guards who'd quit their posts, citizens who'd hidden refugees, families who'd refused registration despite the penalties. All small acts. None of them revolutionary, but accumulated, they mattered, showed that the council's victory was incomplete, that control required constant pressure, that every enforcement cost more than the last. Varric understood then what he'd been too blind to see before. Change didn't come from heroes, from grand gestures, from men willing to die for principles. It came from normal people making small choices repeatedly, from accumulated doubt eroding certainty, from systems that cost more to maintain than they were worth. His rebellion had failed. But failure had taught more than victory ever could, had shown exactly what the kingdom feared, had proven that thrown-away people didn't disappear quietly, had planted questions that would outlive any answer the council provided. Years passed. Elira grew, became something neither princess nor rebel, just a woman who'd seen too much too young and carried it quietly. She never spoke about returning, about reclaiming anything, just lived with the kind of intentional presence that came from understanding how easily it could all be taken away. Cerys thrived in ways she never had in the palace, without expectations, without performance, just existing as herself. She taught in the settlement, helped the sick, built the kind of life that mattered to people instead of systems. And Varric aged, hurt, watched his family build something that palaces could never touch, and slowly learned that maybe dignity wasn't about dying defiant. Maybe it was about living deliberately, about choosing every day to build instead of burn, about understanding that survival with people you loved was victory enough. On his 50th birthday, Elira gave him a letter, different handwriting, official seal broken. It had traveled far to reach them, from Marcus, the young guard who'd questioned. The letter was short. The kingdom was changing, slowly, grudgingly, laws being revised, restrictions easing, not because of moral awakening, just because enforcement cost too much, because resistance had become normal, because enough people had decided that compliance wasn't worth the price. The council blamed Varric, called it his lasting poison, the damage one mad king had done to centuries of order. They were probably right. But poison was just medicine from the wrong perspective, and the kingdom he'd failed to change was changing anyway, not through revolution, through erosion, through accumulated choices, through people deciding quietly that the old way wasn't working anymore. Varric sat on the porch of the house he'd built, watched sunset paint the mountains, felt Cerys beside him, Elira inside cooking dinner, heard laughter that never existed in palaces. He'd lost everything that mattered to the man he'd been: crown, kingdom, legacy, all of it traded away for survival. But the man he'd become understood something the king never could. That sometimes losing was how you found what actually mattered. That failure was just success measured against the wrong goals. That dignity wasn't about standing above everyone, but about knowing who deserved standing beside. The philosophers would call his life a tragedy. The ambitious king brought low by sentiment, the cautionary tale about choosing family over duty. But sitting there, watching day surrender to night, feeling the warmth of people who'd chosen him as deliberately as he'd chosen them, Varric understood they were wrong. This wasn't tragedy. This was just life, raw, honest, stripped of everything except what survived when you lost everything else. And what survived was enough. More than enough. Was everything that mattered when you stopped measuring worth by how much you controlled and started measuring by who you protected. The mountains held his past, the kingdom his failure, the grave his eventual destination. But the house behind him held his present, and that was worth more than any crown had ever been. That was the final truth, the one you learned only by losing everything else. That power was empty. Control was lonely. Authority was just organized isolation. But love, messy, complicated, requiring sacrifice, that was real, that endured, that mattered when everything else turned to ash. Varric had been king, revolutionary, monster, martyr, all the roles that history would assign him. But tonight he was just a father, a partner, a man who'd failed spectacularly at everything except protecting the people who made failure bearable. And in the quiet of evening, with pain in his bones and scars across his soul and nothing left to prove, he finally understood. That was enough. That was everything. That was victory measured against the only scale that mattered. The sun set. Night came. And Varric sat breathing, living. holding the simple truth that survival with love was worth more than any empire built on everyone else's broken backs. The kingdom would endure. Laws would change. New kings would rise and fall. History would remember him however it needed to justify whatever came next. But here, in this remote place where power couldn't reach, he'd built something no council could vote away. No army could conquer. No philosophy could diminish. He'd built home. With people who chose him despite everything, who saw him fail and loved him anyway, who understood that strength wasn't dominance, but the courage to admit when you were wrong and keep living anyway. That was the resolution. Not dramatic, not satisfying to people who wanted clean endings, just honest, just human, just the simple acknowledgement that sometimes the best you could do was survive with the people who mattered and call that victory enough. And as night deepened and stars emerged and somewhere far away the kingdom he'd tried to change continued without him, Varric closed his eyes and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because he'd won, not because he was right, just because he'd finally stopped fighting battles that couldn't be won and started protecting the small territory that actually mattered. The war was over. He'd lost. And somehow in losing, he'd found everything worth keeping. That was enough. That was everything. That was the only ending that mattered when you stripped away ego and ambition and all the noise that told you significance came from scale instead of substance. He'd been king of a nation. Now he was guardian of 3 lives, including his own. And the math worked better, the purpose clearer, the cost worth paying. That was legacy. Not monuments or laws or history's judgment, just love that survived failure. Family that endured exile, home built from ruins. And in the darkness, with pain and peace existing side by side, Varric finally let himself believe it. He'd done enough, been enough, mattered enough. Not to kingdoms, not to history, not to the grand philosophical questions about power and justice and all the things that sounded important but dissolved when you actually tried to hold them. Just to these people, in this place, in this moment. And that was victory, measured against the only scale that survived when everything else fell away. That was the end. Not dramatic, not conclusive, just honest, just human, just enough.